G'day mate, 40 here. So I've twice had my live stream shut down this morning, and both times after I made the point that several, many prominent figures in politics and in another realm of the political that's not explicitly politics have made exaggerated claims on behalf of something that I think is good and worthy, but they made exaggerated claims that were not true, and as a result they lost credibility. How it's always tempting to lie for a good cause, and then after I made that point, right, I got shut down. So it's entirely possible that what happened was just some kind of technical snafu, all right? But on the other hand, I could also think, oh man, you can't say the truth, and it disrupts your flow. Right, flow, comfort. All right, that's an important part of doing a good live stream, because when more and more of your cognitive resources go to just maintaining the technical parts of your stream or firing them up again and getting everything aligned, right, it takes away from the amount of cognitive processes that you have available for making your points. And so that's the situation. What do you then do with it? You immediately go to, oh man, I can't make this elementary and overwhelmingly, factually true and empirically unassailable point, because every time I make this obvious point, I get shut down. Or I could just say, hey, that's the nature of reality. Maybe just learn from the experience and power forward. So maybe I won't reiterate the point that seems to keep getting me shut down. This is Matt Pottinger. He served in the Trump administration. He's the editor of a forthcoming book, The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Here he's talking to the Goodfellows crowd at the Hoover Institute.
I think what's more important are the similarities, because of course there are very important differences between Cold War I and II. There are important differences between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. But if you look at the similarities, you start to appreciate the kind of strategy that we need to employ in order to win Cold War II and to prevent it from becoming World War III. Neil's talked a lot and for a very long time about the fact that we're in Cold War II. He's absolutely right about that. Henry Kissinger, as you've often noted, Neil, a few years ago said, I fear that we're in the foothills of Cold War II. I actually think we're now moving just over the past year in particular into the foothills of a great power war that Beijing and its axis of chaos is leading us into, because they're pushing against an open door. They're finding that we are unwilling as democracies to effectively deter or credibly deter. And so they're just pushing forward and forward and forward, and they're finding mush instead of steel. And until they find steel, they're not going to withdraw. And I fear that we're moving into a much more dangerous scenario. Why do I say the last year? Well, it was really about a year ago. It was in March of 2023 that Xi Jinping made this very important visit. It was really a watershed visit to the Kremlin. This is really at the 1-year anniversary, more or less, of the full-blown invasion by Putin of Ukraine. And Xi Jinping at this point says, doubles down on their no limits pact. Xi Jinping says, you and I are the ones driving the changes that are occurring in the world, the changes that only occur once in a century. And now we know that Chinese material support for the war in Europe skyrocketed beginning in that month. CSIS did an important study of this a couple of months ago, the think tank in Washington, D.C., but also Tony Blinken essentially, in effect, admitted that this is what took place when he visited just a few weeks ago Beijing, to say China is now overwhelmingly the number one supporter of the war in Beijing, has materially affected the outcome of the war. Tony Blinken said that Russia would not have been able to sustain the war the way that it has without Chinese support in particular. So it was really, I think, in March of last year that this became a full-blown proxy war by China, a Chinese proxy war against the West. And now they're repeating that playbook in the Middle East, hosting terrorist organizations like Hamas. They're the number one material supporter of Iran, the number one propaganda and diplomatic supporter for them. And now they're looking for the next crisis that they're either going to fan the flames of or light. And that could be South China Sea, where things are heating up. It could be Taiwan, which is the big one that is the subject of my new book. Or it could be Venezuela and Guyana. It could be new fronts that open up in Europe. So deterrence is really more the same, Bill, I would say, than it is different. It means that we've got to show that we have hard power above all that could effectively win in a fight. And our leaders have to stop saying what they would never do. This is like the cardinal sin of leadership. You don't say what you would never do. I mean, it's like giving a green light to your adversaries, to aggressors, to start aggressing. And that's what we're feeling the heat of right now. I'm waiting for President Biden to learn the lesson of the mistakes of his failed deterrence in Afghanistan, in Europe, in the Middle East, but no signs yet that he's there.
Okay, some more highlights from this discussion.
Different from the Vietnam model, John. But look, the book is called The Boiling Moat because even though China is very close to Taiwan, geography can be China's, or rather Taiwan's friend in this situation. What would Ukraine have given to have 100 miles of ocean between it and Putin's Russia? So rather than thinking just about this idea of a porcupine, something that would be hard to swallow in the event that China were able to land in Taiwan, the real framing that we lay out here is that China should never be able to set foot on Taiwan.
So President Biden on 4 separate occasions has said that the United States will go to war to defend Taiwan. John Mearsheimer makes the point that the American elites have already decided this, that we will go to war to defend Taiwan, even though it might cost us tens of billions of dollars, countless numbers of American lives, that China may flatten many of our overseas bases. And should we really do this? Should we allow Japan and the countries who feel threatened by China to bear the full burden of restricting China's rise? Right, there's a case to be made for that right now. It appears clear that we will go to war to defend Taiwan, but why not just leave it up to Korea and Japan and Taiwan? Like, Taiwan only spends 1% of its budget on its defense, right? Israel spends what, 5-10% of its budget on defense. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel started spending 10% or more of its federal budget on defense, and it was a lost decade economically. Israel was racked by debt and inflation, a result of the vast amount of spending it was doing on defense. But Taiwan isn't taking their own defense terribly seriously. So why should the United States be willing to sacrifice so much to defend an island that's not terribly interested in defending itself?
Moat could become a boiling moat, a tangchi, which is the Chinese Han Dynasty phrase that we derive the title from. It was a Han Dynasty diplomat who said, "Look, when you're dealing with these little city-states on the borderlands that have metal ramparts and boiling moats, it's better not to fight them head on. Try to find another way to take that kind of territory." And amphibious assaults are an extremely difficult form of warfare to pull off successfully. Blockades are not as easy as people assume either. And if the advantage that we, and when I say we, we're really talking about Japan, the United States, Taiwan, and Australia as sort of the primary actors on the good guys' side, the good fellows' side. What we need to do is look at how Japan should stop pretending that they might be able to sit this one out. When I talk to Japanese officials and former military officers and some current military officers, they say, of course, we're going to have to fight. I mean, it's going to become obvious. What we urge in the book, and I've got chapters submitted by Grant Newsham, a former Marine colonel, as well as Yoji Koda, who is the former commander of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Koda. What they're talking about is being more open about what the consequences would be now, so that you derive that deterrent value, but also preparing Japanese society. Koda-san, Admiral Koda, makes clear that Japan is going to have to make available all of its civilian infrastructure, hundreds, more than 100 airstrips, hospitals for the tens of thousands of casualties that it potentially would come from conflict, and really to start building, stitching together that sense of a civilian set of obligations in wartime. Same thing with Taiwan. We've chapters about what Taiwan needs to do, things it shouldn't be doing, equipment it should be divesting of, new equipment it should be buying, but more than anything, adopting something more like an Israeli model for their reserve force.
Yeah, I'm coming back here 1,000 times if I have to. If I have to restart this stream 1,000 times, that's what I'm going to do. That's how the world works. They don't do this to me.
Of course. I brought a bunch of Israeli generals to Taiwan last summer, and a former Israeli national security advisor. The Taiwanese were very interested. They wanted to talk about David Sling and Iron Dome and all this equipment. And what the Israelis wanted to talk to them about was, how come your your reserve system's so screwed up? Why is it that you've got millions of reservists who never train instead of a smaller set of reservists who train obsessively and realistically? And so we had very good exchanges about that. And chapter 4 of the book goes into some depth about the new military culture Taiwan needs to adapt rapidly. On the U.S. side, it's a recognition that we need to be building munitions much faster, moving away from this sort of cost plus.
Yeah, it's interesting that the entire West, all right, the United States and Europe cannot keep up with the munition production of one backward economy, Russia. So Russia can get its act together to create the munitions it needs to prosecute the war against Ukraine, but the entire West can't match Russia in producing munitions.
Old model for building weapons and munitions towards something that actually leverages our innovative sector and the private sector to do things like what Elon Musk did when we moved away from a cost plus NASA model and said, hey, look, here's how much money we've got available. Can you build a better rocket faster? And he comes back and completely revolutionizes the space industry. That's what we need to be doing urgently in the manufacture of munitions. So those are a few of the recommendations that we lay out.
Matt, we have just a couple minutes left here. Let me ask you this parting question now with the whole.
To urge Israel not to conduct an operation in Rafah to complete the defeat of Hamas. How can they not do an offensive operation in Rafah? And I think what you saw with these recent civilian casualties is there's no such thing as a precision raid into a dense urban area that's controlled by a terrorist organization. And if you do a major offensive operation, heck, it's a heck of a lot safer for the innocent civilians. And of course, it's quite necessary. And we still have 8 Americans, held hostage there among we hope, the 120 or so who remain alive. But we keep finding more and more dead hostages and hearing more and more stories about how they were tortured and killed. So I was surprised at the degree that we have been weak in our support of Israel in what is a necessary mission to complete the destruction of a terrorist organization that is determined to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. So I think that's been my greatest disappointment. I could add energy policy to that to tie in with what John said, how self-defeating we've been. I mean, declaring a moratorium on permitting for LNG export facilities. I mean, really? When this is a tremendous opportunity for us to drive the price down, to bridge away from coal, for example, and actually reduce carbon emissions, to hurt some of our adversaries who use that energy for coercive purposes.
I mean, I have so much energy today. I had 2 cups of coffee this morning. I haven't had 2 cups of coffee in months. I haven't had any coffee in 3 weeks. So I was all prepared to live stream. I was so fired up. But it does take something out of you. Like when you have 2 streams, killed, and then having to reload everything and then get frustrated that when you reloaded the stream, it's not, coming forward through, for example, Twitter or X, and having to, get all your settings revamped, right? It's a punch in the gut, man.
I mean, the self-defeating nature of the administration's energy policy is just astounding to me.
Let me add, HR.
I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong with a live stream, right? It's kind of amazing that they come off as cleanly as they do.
3 questions for you today, gentlemen. The first comes from Scotty in Canada, who writes, and I quote, "This show has helped open my eyes to some of the problems in universities. I still hope to be an assistant professor at a North American business school after I finish my PhD. Do you have any advice for current PhD students / assistant professors so that we do not perpetuate the current problems in universities as we advance in our academic careers? Thank you."
Yeah, I say focus on the mission, right? Your mission is to educate. And I think about my best professors have always been those where I couldn't really tell where they were leaning on particular issues because we read a broad range of perspectives and discussed them in an open manner. So, hey, I just think if you focus on the mission of education, which maybe some of our universities are rediscovering, maybe even Harvard is, it seems like, Neil, I think that's the best advice I could give you.
Mm-hmm. Neil?
My advice to any young PhD, and I've been asked this question many times recently, is diversify, because you can't rely on the career paths of the past to be open to you.
Now, this sounds like, excellent advice, right?
And I think that can take many forms, but I'm struck by how many historians these days are making a living from writing books and doing podcasts, educating a wide.
Right. So Neil Ferguson certainly diversified out of the normal academic focus, but in so doing, he cost himself credibility in the academic world. Just like the author of Love Story, the novel, Eric Siegel, right? He was denied tenure at Yale University as an English literature professor because of the trashy nature of his book. So too, as Neil Ferguson has diversified over the past 20 years, all right, much of his output has been trashy. and that's cost him academic credibility. So diversifying, what could possibly go wrong? Sounds like wonderful advice, right? But you can diversify so that you cost yourself credibility with the one arena that's most important to you, right? I think there's something called the John Yoo line that Andrew Gelman talks about, where once you cross it, right, once your output becomes sufficiently trashy, you can never regain your academic credibility. And Neil Ferguson, crossed the John Yoo line about 20 years ago. John Yoo is the lawyer who came up with the George W. Bush administration's legal rationale for enhanced interrogation techniques, aka torture. And you see his output. He's now at the University of California, Berkeley Law School, and his output is quite low IQ and doesn't stand up to academic analysis. And he's kind of given up trying to create academically respectable work. And Neil Ferguson gave up on that 20 years ago. Nathan Kofnas, by contrast, he is diversified, but he still maintains his primary focus on putting out academic quality work. He has to be careful, though, in his Twitter and Substack and video presentations that he doesn't undercut that. Because when you do academic work, you spend more time on it, right? You have more time to think through what you're doing. You often will solicit feedback. Well, when you produce just popular work, you just may put it out there without adequate consideration, and it's tempting and it becomes addictive often as the e-personality takes over to get intoxicated by your stream of consciousness work for the public that destroys your credibility in academic life.
To the public rather than from teaching classes. So my advice to our listener is diversify. The tenure track path may not be open to you, certainly if the current hiring patterns are to continue.
John.
All right, Mearsheimer, you think he's said everything that he could possibly bring you on the Israel lobby? Well, I like his insights here.
The party is basically split on Israel. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, broadly defined, is quite hostile to Israel at this point in time and thinks Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And the Republicans see this as an opportunity to get full support from the lobby and to turn the lobby against the Democratic Party. So almost every Republican in the land is going to great lengths trying to kiss up to the lobby. And Joe Biden is really in a very difficult position as a result of this, because he's deeply fearful that he will alienate the lobby if he plays hardball with Israel. But at the same time, he understands if he doesn't do something to show that he can get semi-tough with the Israelis, he doesn't have to do much, but just a little bit, he can then win over the progressives who are abandoning him in droves. But the fact is, he's caught between a rock and a hard place, and there's not much he can do to win. And the Republicans fully understand this, and for that reason, the Republicans have embraced the lobby in ways that we have not seen in the past.
It is really amazing. All over the democratic world, all over the world entirely, people are increasingly opposed to the Israeli war in Gaza. They are increasingly horrified by the things they're seeing there. They want this war over. They've been
Now, if an Arab state, killed 35,000 fellow Arabs, would the world similarly be galvanized? And no, we have many examples, such as Jordan, wiping out tens of thousands of Palestinians, did not galvanize the world to the same extent as when white people, when Israelis do it, it tends to galvanize world opinion much more than when fellow Arabs do it.
Cutting diplomatic ties with Israel, recognizing the Palestinian state. And yet here in the United States, we're about to have a presidential campaign and a presidential debate where the two primary candidates are just going to be arguing with one another about who is more pro-Israel. There'll be no debate at all about this incredibly consequential and polarizing and costly policy. They'll both be fighting with one another over who can be more pro-Israel. And I guess that, in a sense, has been what American politics has been for the last several decades. And I do want to just push a little bit, or not push, but just kind of re-ask the question about, obviously there's a finance pro-Israel lobby. There are American Jews who feel a connection to Israel the way lots of minority groups feel a connection to the country of their origin, whether it's the place they come from when they immigrate, or Italy, or Ireland, whatever. People have these kinds of connections. But you do now have an extremely vocal, and I think increasing, factor in the Republican Party primarily that has caused this defense of Israel to become even more fortified and almost absolute, which is this evangelical and theological motivation. Do you think that that is a significant or non-trivial factor now and why there's so much congressional support for Israel?
It's non-trivial for sure, but I don't think it's the key. I think that most of the people who feel that way are Christian Zionists, and I think the Christian Zionists are an important part of the Israel lobby, as Steve and I articulated in our book. But I think that it's American Jews who are deeply committed to Israel and want the United States to support Israel unconditionally, who are really driving the train. And a lot of this has to do with campaign contributions. There's just no getting around that. You noticed that the other day, Donald Trump visited a group of rich donors, many of whom are Jewish, and he told them that he would basically deport the protesters. He'd arrest them and deport them. That's how he'd deal with all the unrest on campuses. I mean, this is hard to believe that he said that in a serious way, but he did. And the question you want to ask yourself is, why did he say that? And the point is, he wanted campaign contributions.
Oh my, a politician made an exaggerated claim about what they would do. Shocking.
And that's why he was meeting with these rich donors. So that is an important part of the story for sure.
And just to underscore the point, within, I think, 48 hours, it was announced that Sheldon Adelson's widow, Sheldon Adelson was a multi-billionaire who said his big issue was Israel, who refunded the Republican Party to keep it very pro-Israel. She announced, or someone announced on her behalf, that they were going to create a pro-Trump PAC and that she would finance it on a level never previously seen in presidential politics. So the Adelsons, whose primary issue by far is Israel, obviously was responding to those statements by Trump, where he said what you said, as well as I will be the most pro-Israel politician in our history.
But you want to remember, Glenn, as I said before, and you have been saying in the conversation here, Israel is in real trouble. And these donors and these staunch supporters of Israel, these people in the lobby, these institutions in the lobby, they all understand that Israel is in deep trouble. So they're willing.
Right. The intensity of the support is in proportion to the amount of trouble that Israel is in, right? Israel is in a very difficult position. There's an excellent article in the Claremont Review of Books that I want to get to in a minute. But first of all, let's look at the chat. How far are we from seeing a viable candidate for American political office asking, why should we care what happens with Israel and Palestine or Russia versus Ukraine when it doesn't affect the vital interests of Americans? Another chat. Israeli forces now operating in most areas of Rafah. Apparently this doesn't break Joe Biden's red line because Israel has successfully evacuated 1 million Palestinians out of Rafah.
Willing to find politicians who will support Israel hook, line, and sinker and give them all the support that they need to win. And that's what's going on here. And the Republicans, again, understand that the Democrats are in trouble on this issue from a political point of view, because you have a huge number of Democrats who believe that Israel is committing genocide. A huge number of Democrats believe that Israel is committing genocide and that the United States should move to cause a ceasefire right away. And these rich donors do not want to hear that. So they're willing to support people like Trump or make it clear to Biden that he better change his tune, or else they'll go to great lengths to defeat him in the fall.
When you say Israel is in deep trouble, that these pro-Israel donors and activists understand that, what do you mean by Israel is in deep trouble? Is it that they're involved in a war for which they have no ultimate outcome or plan? Is it that they're more isolated than ever on the world stage and the international community? Or is it something else? What kind of deep trouble do you consider them to be in?
Well, I'd make two arguments. One is Israel is an apartheid state. Right? As Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization in Israel, have made clear, all three of those human rights organizations have made clear in extensive reports that Israel is an apartheid state.
And excuse me for interrupting there just quickly. So have many top Israeli officials, including the former head of the Mossad chosen by Bibi Netanyahu in 2015, who the month prior to October 7th published an article in The Guardian saying Israel is now either very close to, on the brink of, or has become an apartheid state.
Yes, but that's very important, Glenn, because that's just evidence that leaders in Israel understand this phenomenon, right? They understand that Israel is an apartheid state.
Okay, I'm more interested in the game of power rather than, what international norms is Israel violating. All right, interesting discussion here with Vali Nasr. Right, he's an expert on Iran. He is the Majid Kaduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Senior Fellow on the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. And here he's speaking to Foreign Affairs magazine.
And 70s. There are periods that Iran and Israel, silently cooperated. For instance, when Iran was under attack by Iraq, the Israelis did provide Iran with a lot of war material because it was the only military in the region which had American-made war material, and Iran's military was still dependent on American technology then. But gradually, Iranians sort of dug into exploiting the Arab anger towards Israel as a strategic crutch for themselves in the Middle East. The more the Arabs pushed against Iran in supporting an American containment strategy, the more the Iranians became interested in exploiting the Achilles heel of the Arab regimes, which was the Israel issue. And that was really the basis of their investment in Hezbollah, because they saw Hezbollah and the war in Lebanon as part of their own security issue. And so by the contemporary period, the Iranians have come to view Israel as the only force in the region that matters. So as Iran is seeking great power status in the region, what other power in the region is capable, willing, and determined to stand in Iran's way? And that is Israel. Because the Arab world as a whole is not a threat to Iran anymore with the fall of Iraq after 2003. Iranians see them essentially as being maneuvered by the United States and Israel, but they themselves are not rivals to Iran's great power position. Iran has penetrated the Arab world very effectively since 2003. So Israel and Iran now are the two gorillas in the ring. Turkey periodically rears its head, but these are the two gorillas. And if you look at the current situation, as important as Saudi Arabia is really a prize for the two sides. Both sides are trying to woo Saudi Arabia into, in the case of Iran, into neutrality, and in the case of Israel, into an anti-Iran axis. But Saudi Arabia itself is no longer the main threat to Iran, is not a main threat to Israel. In fact, there's no Arab army that is a threat to Israel, including Egypt, because of all the alliances, peace treaties, etc. So for Israel, Iran is the last and the largest and the biggest Middle East obstacle to what it wants in the region. And for Iran, Israel, either on its own or as a deputy of the United States, is blocking its way. So that's the way we arrive at October 7th, if you would. Now, you're right. Hamas is not a Shia organization. Of course, Shia forces are closer to Iran because of the commonality of faith. But we often forget that that sectarian alliance also had to do with some kind of a strategic consensus, because the Shias saw themselves as facing the same Sunni threat, whether it's in Iraq or in Lebanon or in these pockets in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, or even in Pakistan. And therefore, they saw a common front with Iran in confronting the Sunnis, right? So there always was this strategic logic that went beyond just affinity of faith. Now, Hamas, when the Arab Spring happened, actually sympathized with the Sunni Arab world. It broke with Bashar Assad, it left Damascus, it broke with Iran. But then under the pressure of Israelis, as particularly they became more aggressive on settlements, as it looked like the West Bank was gradually being completely squeezed into annexation, as there was no hope for Gaza, and then it looked like the world basically forgot about the Palestinians, that they basically decided that they needed Iran and Hezbollah's strategic depth. And what brought them together essentially is this idea of resistance. Resistance is now a more important idea than sectarian divide.
So in the 8 or so months since the October 7th attacks, we've seen kind of a range of different kinds of activities by other members of that axis of resistance. The Houthi strikes on ships in the Red Sea. We've seen strikes by Shia militias in Iraq and Syria on U.S. and other bases. Hezbollah has been exchanging fire over the northern border with Israel, though that's been, I think, more restrained than many people feared in those first weeks after the attacks. As you look at those different activities, what is the kind of theory of the case behind them from an Iranian perspective? What's the strategy? And how well has that worked? If you're, an IRGC commander looking at your performance in the region over the last 8 months or so, are you happy with where things stand and how it's playing to Iranian interests?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think they're happy. Not only Iranians, Hezbollah, even Hamas is happy. Because, if you looked at Israel's firepower and its ability to inflict pain or hit a target inside Iran or hit Lebanon, there's one way you can look at this, that Israel is still extremely powerful. It has America's backing. It still has the most advanced weaponry. It's still a nuclear-powered state. All of those are true. But Hamas's biggest victory was essentially to shatter, first of all, Israel's notion of deterrence. Secondly, it also shattered the sense of security that the Israeli citizens and public felt. Behind the Iron Dome, behind the fences, behind the sort of the way in which the Netanyahu government had portrayed Israel as 10 feet tall, that it could deal with everybody in the region. And so that immediately was a massive victory for Iran and Hezbollah, because their main adversary was diminished. in a way. And in fact, the way Israel reacted underscored that. They saw this ferocity of Israeli reaction, not just as anger and revenge, but also as a desperation to very quickly restore both deterrence and sense of security to their population. The third victory for both Hamas and the axis of resistance was the Palestinian issue immediately came back to center stage. The issue of normalization with the Arab world basically is here and there, but nowhere. And now it's becoming contingent on a Palestinian state. So these were all victories right on October 8th. And then the Iranians and Hezbollah calculated that the angry Israel that they saw was going to try to destroy Hamas. And then he was going to go after Hezbollah, and then was going to go after Iran. I mean, this was very much even in the Israeli rhetoric then, that look, the worst has happened, now gloves are off, and we're going to deal with this security issue around us once and for all. And that's why they began to sort of try to establish deterrence with Israel. Hezbollah tried to very early on indicate, don't mess with us. And then the Iranians basically began, a lot of their minions began attacking from Iraq, sending missiles towards Haifa, hitting American targets in Iraq and Syria. The Houthis got involved. And all of this was basically to sort of try to contain Israel's enthusiasm for finishing the job once and for all. So I think the Iranians are now sitting there saying that they didn't plan October 7th the way it unfolded. They expected an Israeli reaction, but not the level at which Israel reacted, which actually has surprised everybody. But everything that's happened since October 7th, now several months forward, has actually not changed the fundamental strategic outcome of October 7th. And Israel, as we're speaking, does not have a way in which to get back to where it is. And it's going into Rafah, is in fact risking its relations with Egypt, relations with Jordan, relations with Saudis. And so as the Arab world gets angrier, it means that the Arab public is moving in the direction of the axis of resistance, which puts pressure on their own governments.
If you talk to members of the Biden administration, they will defend their policy since October 7th by focusing on
Okay, I thought that was a sobering assessment of how the conflict in and around Israel and Gaza is working out to Iran's benefit. So, thoughtful essay here in the Claremont Review of Books. Is Israel Defensible? The Cruel Geostrategic Logic of the Holy Land. Oof. I still feel all this unnecessary muscular tension from having my stream shut down twice, being on my third stream for this morning. And also, it's so much more technically challenging to do a live stream over restream, because then you probably should monitor 6 different restreams at once, and there are many more things to keep an eye on, which reduces the amount of cognitive processing that you have for what you say. So Art Bell has often made the point in my comment section on YouTube that I should do one of my relaxed streams where I'm just sitting down talking to my iPhone, because then I don't have to worry about any other technical qualities. I just talk to the iPhone, and there's more cognitive processing power available to me to make an argument, to make a joke. And Bell notices, how much tighter I am when I'm doing something over Restream and through, OBS Streamlabs, as opposed to just talking to my iPhone. And so trying to let go of this unnecessary tension. And the quickest way I can usually do this is by adopting the attitude that I don't know anything. Let go of everything that I think I know. That tends to release a little bit of unnecessary tension in my neck and shoulders and back, but I can hear it in my voice. It's weaker because the more tension I have in my body, like even additional tension in my ankles or in, around my pelvis or in my forehead, around my eyes, will reduce the quality of my voice. La 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 la. Long time since I've done any la la las. This is an Alexander technique exercise that, unlike many breath exercises, it begins with the outflow of breath. So Christopher Caldwell writes for the Claremont Review of Books, by expelling the breath, it allows room for more breath to come in, and it usually helps you have a stronger voice quality. So Israel Defensible, the Cruel Geostrategic Logic of the Holy Land. And so he talks about how the Israeli settlements on the West Bank are part of a conscious but never written down government policy. So a lot of policies, whether in business, in a religious community, or in government, are not written down. Right? So it's part of a conscious Israeli strategy to divide the Palestinian population as to make the massing of force difficult and conspicuous, right? To separate Jerusalem from the Palestinian hinterland and to provide the populated area of Israel with enough strategic depth to minimize the damage of a sudden invasion. Like, Israel is a tiny nation, right? It has, very little width, certain parts, only a few miles across. And so these Jewish settlements in the West Bank provide Israel with enough strategic depth to make the state defensible. And so a defensible state in this area, right, the country is a logical geostrategic unit, essentially runs from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, right, from the river to the sea. So on this, hardline Israelis and Palestinians can agree. So why has Israel consistently shifted to the right over the past 30 years? Because Israel's been constantly at war, and Israel's becoming a more religious nation. So as Israel is dealing with more and more violent threats, right, it's going to become more right-wing. If American citizens feel like the United States is dealing with more violent threats, the United States will become more right-wing. So if the 2024 election is fought primarily over the national defense of America, over issues of crime and illegal immigration, and over issues of the economy, right, Donald Trump will likely win. So for Jews who are committed to their religion and to their people in a traditional way, right, Israel is growing steadily more attractive. So more and more right-wing Jews are moving to Israel. So Israel is the red state of world Jewry. And after the October 7 attack, right, when Israeli reservists were called up, typically 40% of reservists plead non-availability when they're called up in Israel. This time, 130% of reservists reported. That is, men not required to go to war were refusing to leave army officers until they had received a role in this dangerous conflict. So Israelis are one people in a way that Americans are not. Right? The Israeli left and right, even at their most hateful, are competing for patriotic distinction. So Israel faces a challenge that we all face. Do you want to primarily be part of the wider world at the risk of losing yourself, your own identity, your culture, your connection to God, your religious identity? Or do you want to keep to yourself at the risk of becoming provincial and losing economic opportunity? So the most productive, economically productive parts of Israel tend to be the least religious parts of Israel, while the most religious parts of Israel don't serve by and large in the armed forces. So Netanyahu's coalition partners have a traditional vision for defending Israel. It's all about sovereignty, pro-natalist policies, meaning policies that encourage more Jewish births, prayer, command and military strongpoints, but it comes at the risk of isolation and retaliation from the outside world. The most important technological and business and entrepreneurial parts of Israel are overwhelmingly secular, and they are primarily interested in good relationships with other global elites, particularly those in the United States. Two different visions, and both essential for Israel's welfare. All right, back to John Mearsheimer here.
And we all know what happened to South Africa. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you think this is sustainable over the long term. And the answer is no. And I think that Israeli leaders are looking for a way out. To go back to what I was saying about ethnic cleansing before, I believe that one of the principal reasons that the Israelis favor ethnic cleansing is because it solves the apartheid problem. If you drive the Palestinians out of Gaza and then you drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank, you have a clear majority of Israeli Jews running Greater Israel, and you don't have an apartheid state. The problem you have now, Glenn, is that there are about 7.3 million Palestinians and 7.3 million Israeli Jews. And the Israeli Jews dominate the Palestinians. They oppress the Palestinians. That's why it's an apartheid state. And that is a huge problem for Israel moving forward. But that's only one dimension of the trouble that they face. The other dimension that the other problem that they face is they're involved in a war where they are being accused of genocide and where lots of people believe they're committing genocide. This is a huge problem. And the problem, in very important ways, is not going to go away. Why is that the case? You remember that in 2005, Ariel Sharon, who was no shrinking violet, pulled Israeli settlers and the Israeli military out of Gaza. And he turned Gaza into a giant open-air prison. And why did he do that? Because he knew the place was a hornet's nest.
Okay, if Gaza's an open-air prison, that's 50% on Egypt. All right, Egypt plays a huge role in keeping Gazans imprisoned to the extent that's true. Right, Egypt has sovereignty over a large part of the Gaza border.
And the last thing he wanted to do was stay in that hornet's nest. He wanted to get out, which he did. Well, if you look at what's happened, the Israelis are back in the hornet's nest.
Right, well, Israel take the ceasefire. I don't know how they can, because it means Hamas won, right? Hamas will retain control of Gaza. So how can Israel accept that?
And is there any way of getting out? I don't see it. If they don't successfully ethnically cleanse Gaza, and let's certainly hope that they don't, that means the Israelis are going to have to run the place. They're going to be in the place for the foreseeable future. This is a disaster for them. The public relations dimension of that alone is going to be a disaster. This problem is not going to go away. There'll be more protests on campuses in the fall. And for as far as the eye can see, as long as the Israelis are in Gaza doing terrible things to the Palestinians, can you tell me how they're going to get out of there anytime soon? I don't think so. That means they're in deep trouble. When you marry that to the apartheid problem, Israel's future does not look rosy.
Yeah, just on that Palestinian point, the South Africa point and the concern about being labeled an apartheid state because it brought down the minority rule government of South Africa, in part that really did happen because of this activist movement, which found expression in large part on campuses in the West and in the United States, demanding the divestment and sanctioning and boycotting of South Africa. And you've seen, and I think a lot of people didn't realize it at the time, a lot of pro-Israel journalists and activists and politicians have been very, very focused on American colleges for a long time. They've been talking about what's going on there. They've made it a priority. They were celebrated when they forced out the presidents of Harvard and Penn for insufficiently cracking down on anti-Israel speech. They've enacted all kinds of laws banning supporters of the boycott.
Just to back up what you're saying, first of all, when I was young, and I think this is probably true when you were young too, the mainstream media basically controlled the discourse about Israel. And the lobby and Israel supporters had huge influence on how Israel was portrayed in the mainstream media. We now have an alternative media where people speak in an honest way about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians.
And I think Mearsheimer is right here. Right. The narrative about Israel, when it was dominated by the mainstream media, was much more constrained than now. I'm unaware of any major pundit in the mainstream news media who was consistently opposed to the Jewish state and consistently was taking the side of the Palestinians.
You're a manifestation of this phenomenon. And there are lots of other outlets that people can go to where they can get a sense of what really has happened over time in Greater Israel and what's happening today. And this causes huge problems for Israel. And this problem wasn't present in the past. The second thing you don't want to lose sight of is, again, when I was young, and it was probably true when you were young, if you came to a university like the University of Chicago or Georgetown University, most of the students were white, right? There were a smattering of black students for sure, but it was a very white campus. There hadn't been a lot of immigration. And furthermore, there were not that many international students on campus.
Right. So white Christian Americans are either unconcerned about the Middle East or tend to support Israel. Non-white Americans tend to be much more anti-Israel.
Campus. What's happened over time is, as a result of immigration, the United States
and the Jewish community, by and large, has sided with the coalition of the fringe against the white Christian core of the United States, against that part of the American electorate that is most pro-Israel. So by pushing diversity and immigration, right, Jewish elite organizations have played a role in these campus protests and decreasing American support for Israel, particularly among the young.
It's just become a much more heterogeneous society. And you have all sorts of people who come from countries where there's no real sympathy for Israel. And you also have lots of international students. And very importantly, you have lots of students from the Arab and Islamic world who come, who get educated, and who write books of their own, who become professors, who become the heads of Middle East centers at universities, right? So they are in a position to tell a story, right, that, excuse me, Glenn, that contradicts the basic Israeli story about the creation of Israel and what's going on today. And that message that those people are sending out gets picked up by people like you. And people like me don't have to worry about being called by NPR or the New York Times, who have no interest in talking to me, because I know that people like you will call me up and we can come on this show, we can talk about these things, and millions of people can listen to us discuss the issue in a rational, legal way. This is a huge problem for the lobby. And by the way, one final point, this is why the lobby is going after TikTok.
Exactly. I just wanted to...
So the more you're thinking, all right, the harder you're thinking, you can't help but have increased muscular tension, all right? You can't have a thought without a ripple of muscular tension. Now, through learning the Alexander technique, you can reduce the amount of unnecessary muscular tension, but there will always be a ripple of muscular tension when you're thinking. The more intense your cognitive load, all right, the more tension you will have, which will always play a role in your voice. So you can reduce the amount of unnecessary tension, but there will always be ripples of tension, which is why women in particular are so astute often at noticing the ripple of muscles through your face and through your body, and tend to be more astute at, appraising what's going on with one's internal life than do men. They pick up on these signals. But it requires an increase in muscular tension to do cognitive labor. So just as when you're doing the most intense cognitive labor, you're burning the most calories, you're more likely to sweat and to get tired. And my father, who did 2 PhDs, he noted that the absolute maximum for the amount of time that you can do serious study is about 6 hours a day because of the cognitive load. And I can just kind of hear the cognitive load in my voice. Rawr. All right, some good points in the chat here by Bob Outberger. Is the reason that Israel is so interesting is because it is the exemption to the post-World War II global order, where the conquest of new land is illegal, yet Israel does it. Is Israel perhaps providing a blueprint to other nations? The right-wing tilt of Israel, it's about identity, it's about religion, it's about everything the liberal order supposedly had overcome. So Israel is dealing with war and peace and its own survival. They are facing the destruction of their own nation. The rest of us are browsing the web and watching TikTok videos. So I just read a thoughtful essay about this by Randall Schweller, who I played excerpts of his videos Monday and Tuesday this past week. He wrote an essay, he wrote a book back in 2010 called Unanswered Threats, Political Constraints on the Balance of Power. So he's essentially asking here, why do nations not react the way offensive realism, the perspective of John Mearsheimer, why do they not react in accord with its precepts, so that why are nations not expanding when that seems to be in their best interests, particularly in the third world? So the British Empire, according to Winston Churchill, was acquired in a fit of absent-mindedness. But usually when you get an empire, when you get territorial expansion, that usually advances through a deliberate and collective will to imperial power, through a single-mindedness for expansion shared by both the rulers and the ruled. So those people who have expanded their nation usually zealously pursue their expansionist aim with a strong and unified community behind them, not a weak and fragmented one. So according to the doctrines of offensive realism, which is John Mearsheimer's worldview, right, nation states operating within an anarchic environment, states must provide for the means of their own security, and they must devise strategies about how to meet internal and external challenges. So realists will argue that expansion and preventative aggression to gain control over scarce resources are often the best ways of achieving more power and security in the Thomas Hobbes state of nature. But there have been relatively few bids for such territorial expansion since World War II. This is especially true in the third world, right? Very few third world states have fought interstate wars, right? Even in Africa, very few countries have gone to war with their neighbors. All right, the search for continental hegemony is rare in the third world. It was a common feature of European diplomacy under the Habsburgs, under Louis XIV, Napoleon, Wilhelm, Germany, Hitler, Soviet Union, and the United States. So why do potentially powerful states such as India, South Africa, China, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Brazil remain potential regional hegemons rather than actual hegemons? So one analyst says China remains a classic example of hope over experience, right? Reminiscent of a famous comment about Brazil, it has great potential and always will. So why have we seen so few wars of aggression in modern times?
You have to go out and find them. And a lot of times what we're also seeing is this emotional immaturity is actually the result of dysregulation because of intergenerational trauma. So the third reason is those caregivers experience so much trauma.
So while I take a break, this is a video from Dr. Snipes, 20 Consequences of Emotionally Immature Parents and Tips to Heal. But that just makes me think of many citizens of the Western world who have had emotionally and politically immature leaders who have created a life for citizens that has to be much more hyper vigilant because we have less social trust and less cohesion because we've had such a massive amount of immigration. So apply these analyses from the personal to the public and the political.
That they're unable to use any emotional intelligence tools they have because they are constantly hypervigilant, exhausted, and dysregulating. Unfortunately, children learn emotional intelligence through secure attachment and social interactions. So if the children are not regularly exposed to situations where they can develop that secure attachment, where they can have somebody teach them how to identify their emotions and tolerate them and those sorts of things, they're not going to develop those tools. And, think about how powerful your anger, your anxiety, your depression can be. And then think about it from the perspective of a 5-year-old who has this rush of distressful neurochemicals and stuff. And it's just like, oh my gosh, this feels overwhelming. This feels terrifying. And I don't know how to control it. Help us continue to make practical tools available to everybody by supporting the channel. You can donate any amount at DocSnipes.com.
I'm trying to rest and get my mojo back.
So let's talk about the consequences of emotionally immature caregivers. Attachment trauma is one of the most common things that we see. The child cannot trust the caregivers to sensitively and consistently respond and teach emotion management skills. Sometimes the caregiver may be perfectly regulated and respond in a great manner and be aware and mindful and all that wonderful stuff. Other times the caregiver may not be. They may be dysregulated themselves and unable to respond appropriately. So one day, Johnny may come home with a note from his teacher and the caregiver responds calmly and practically and maturely. And another time, Johnny may bring that same note home and the caregiver loses their ever-loving stuffing. So it's important to recognize that that inconsistency is terrifying. Do I get Jekyll? Do I get Hyde? And caregivers, when they're dysregulated, are often not emotionally aware of or available to their children. They're having difficulty managing their own stuff right then. They're in their own tornado, and it's hard to reach out and help anybody else without sucking them into that tornado. This results in one of 3 different attachment styles. Avoidant attachment, where the child is afraid to connect with others because it's just been so painful so many times. Anxious attachment, where the child has sometimes gotten some positive feedback and some comfort and nurturance, but other times not so much. Or disorganized attachment, where the child is sometimes avoidant, sometimes anxious, depends on the person, depends on the situation. All three of these are considered insecure attachment styles. But when people are insecurely attached, they have difficulty, especially in childhood, they have difficulty feeling safe, which means they have difficulty learning new things. They have difficulty getting into their wise mind and developing those coping skills. This emotional immaturity in caregivers produces insecurity in the child, which produces a lack of trust and safety in the child, which produces hypervigilance, which leads to dysregulation and immature responding. When people are dysregulated, they are in their fight or flight mind. They are in their stress response. They are just steeped in stress hormones. They are not able to think clearly. They're not in their wise mind. And in order to respond maturely, people have to be able to tolerate that distress and get into their wise mind. So these children fail to learn healthy skills. They fail to learn how to recognize and identify their emotions. You know, a lot of times it's just like, I feel bad, I feel awful, I feel disorganized.
Right. Nothing good happens when you're in a state of hypervigilance, which I'm probably in because of all my live streams that have been already shut down this morning. So I couldn't let go of the unnecessary tension that was constricting me and constricting my voice. I just took 2 minutes to lie down, put my feet up on the chair, had 2 pillows behind my head, and just try to let go of this unnecessary tension. And I feel a little freer now. I like the quality of my voice a little bit more, but frankly, I blame destiny. For the first time a week ago, I checked out a Destiny live stream, and I was just so impressed with how much, cognitive processing power he brought, just how quick he was and how much access he had to his emotions, to his intellect, to the chat, to the technical challenges that were going on, that I loaded up on the caffeine and the Adderall this morning to try to approach that level of excellence that Destiny brings to his live streams. And instead I've just driven myself into excessive emotional tension. Okay, back to this great book here by Randall Schweller, came out in 2010, Unanswered Threats, Political Constraints on the Balance of Power. So he notes that fascism shares many of realism's core assumptions about world politics and views about the nature and the role of the state. But there are 2 significant differences between fascism and realism. Fascists do not believe in the balance of power, and they activate realist principles with a racist ideology that will succeed in mobilizing the passions of millions of people. Now, if Germany had not attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, Hitler and Mussolini may well have accomplished bold but prudent expansions of their states. They may well have expanded their states consistent with a realist view of appropriate state interests and behavior, because they did not provoke an overwhelmingly powerful counterbalancing coalition. So a political regime that's able to mobilize its community, to allocate resources to meet its policy commitments, that has broad influence over social activities and social groups, right, is essentially autonomous from domestic and outside pressure groups. Political regime that can command compliance from its subjects, enjoys the general consent of its citizenry, will be less constrained to act in accordance with the dictates of realism, as opposed to a political regime such as the United States have, where you've got a population that's incredibly divided. So he argues that aside from the Mexican-American War, the Indian-American Wars, and the Spanish-American Wars, the United States grew in territory and power largely through the attractiveness of its political system, which proved so seductive that other republics voluntarily relinquished their sovereignty and applied for admission to the American Union. If you want to have an aggressive expansionist foreign policy, you are required to have a unified state. And Israel has a largely unified state right now. So if Israel gets into a wider conflict in the Middle East, it may well try to create a wider Israel by pushing out the Palestinians. That if you have a unified state composed of elites that agree on an ambitious grand strategy and a stable and effective political regime with broad authority, then you can pursue more adventurous foreign policy. So, realism does not provide a theory of despotic power. It does not provide an ideology for whipping up nationalist sentiment to wage large-scale war. There's nothing about realist creed that would stir the passions of the average citizen in support of the state, much less that cause them to rise up as one without regard to hardship. Large-scale mobilization campaigns in pursuit of risky and aggressive expansion usually requires a moral crusade of some kind, which is precisely what realism decries as a basis for foreign policy. So realism is instead a cynical and pessimistic political philosophy about why things tend to remain the same, why wars and conflicts persist, why the struggle for power and prestige among states will endure, and why man cannot hope to be good, but must content with being not too evil. So at its core, realism is a hollow political doctrine. So realism seems logically overwhelming, but it does not provide us with the basis of action which is necessary to the pursuit of thought. Consistent realism excludes four things which appear to be essential ingredients of all effective political thinking: a finite goal, an emotional appeal, a right of moral judgment, and a ground for action. Right? So if you can cloak your interests and your reasons for foreign expansion in the guise of moral principles, that is outside of the basis of foreign policy realism. But fascism is offensive realism with a racist and social Darwinist overlay.
Abductive arguments rest on an inference to the best explanation.
So who can give the best narrative, right? After the Trump conviction, which side will give the best narrative? And abductive arguments are often particularly powerful during a time of national distress.
The simplest way of thinking about this idea is in terms of why questions. Suppose you tell your friend that someone has a crush on him, and his cheeks turn bright red. Why did that happen? What's the explanation? Well, the most natural answer seems to be that it's because he was embarrassed to find out about the crush. That's why his cheeks turned red. This example can be turned into an abductive argument. The premise is, Charlie's cheeks turned red after I told him that Lucy had a crush on him. And the conclusion is, so Charlie was embarrassed to learn about Lucy's crush. Notice that the premise doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is true. Something else might explain it instead. Maybe Charlie was eating a jalapeno and his cheeks turned red because it was so spicy. Or maybe he just got scratched by a cat and he's having an allergic reaction. If you let your imagination rip, you'll be able to think of other possible answers to the question, why did Charlie's cheeks turn red too? Nonetheless, given your background knowledge, C seems like it's the best explanation for P, or at least it's a contender. If it is, then P gives you good reason to believe C.
So I've reached out to Matt, History Speaks, but he has not responded to my DM.
That's how abductive arguments work. We know that some stuff is true, these are the premises, and reason from that to whatever is the best answer to the question, why are these things true? Our knowledge doesn't guarantee that the explanation is correct, but that's okay, because abductive arguments aren't supposed to be deductively valid. Abductive arguments are nonetheless extremely common in all walks of life. It's a very important critical thinking skill to be able to make, spot, and evaluate abductive arguments. Think of how a TV detective solves a crime. Suppose she knows that the murder weapon was found in Smith's trunk. Smith doesn't have an alibi. Smith had a motive, and Smith failed the lie detector test. The best explanation for all this evidence is that Smith's the murderer, and so the detective believes that Smith is the murderer, and for good reason. She passes this argument on to the prosecutor, who uses it to convince the jury to believe its conclusion too. Abduction also plays a crucial role in science. Scientific hypotheses often rest on inferences to the best explanation for some observed data. For example, that's how the planet Neptune was discovered. In the early 1800s, astronomers noticed small discrepancies between the observed orbit of Uranus and the predictions that Newton's theory of motion made about what the orbit should be. The best explanation for these discrepancies was that they were caused by another planet that no one had ever observed. And it turned out that this was correct. There was another planet, which we know as Neptune today. So what makes something a good explanation? Well, there's a lot of debate about this amongst philosophers, but here are two characteristics of good explanations that most generally agree about. First, the more an explanation fits in with everything we already know, the better it tends to be. Consider another possible explanation for the discrepancies between the observed orbit of Uranus and the predictions of Newton's theory, that Newton's theory was wrong. To accept that Newton's theory was wrong would require giving up on lots and lots of other very good explanations, and so wouldn't fit very well with what astronomers already knew. The idea that an unobserved planet was causing the discrepancies fit much better with what they already knew, and so counted as a better explanation. Second, other things being equal, a simpler explanation is better than a complicated one. Here's another possible explanation for Charlie's blush. Maybe he misheard you and thought you said that Penny had a crush on him, and so he's embarrassed to learn about Penny's crush, not Lucy's. This explanation could be right, but it's needlessly complicated. Since the original explanation is simpler, it's preferable to this more complex one. Both fit and simplicity come in degrees, and other factors are also relevant to how good an explanation is. There's no surefire recipe for saying when an explanation is the best one. One way to challenge an abductive argument is to try to come up with a better explanation of the data than what the argument provides. Another way to challenge an abductive argument is to look for more evidence to add to the premises. Suppose the detective also found out that Smith had a very clever nemesis, who had a motive to commit the murder, and had been planning to frame Smith for a long time. Then Smith's being guilty would no longer clearly be the best explanation for all of the...
Okay, some of the basics there on abductive argument. Okay, I was reading an essay by Stephen Turner, published in January 2024, talking about Max Weber, the famous German sociologist who died in the 1920s, and the two universities. So Turner says, no sooner had the ink begun to dry on publications written to celebrate the centennial Max Weber's Science as a Profession and a Vocation, right, which came out in 1919. Then COVID and a series of shocks to the university, especially in the United States, changed the conditions for discourse. Right, these shocks include a dramatic decline in enrollment in college. Right, it was an early arrival of an expected decline in students for long anticipated demographic reasons. We had an unexpectedly rapid decline in enrollment in the humanities, notably in history. We have a growing recognition that young men especially are not choosing to go to college. We have a simultaneous and related turn against wokeness in university. We have rapidly developing skepticism about the medical research establishment and the scientific establishment as a result of certain failures, which I can't mention without my stream getting shut down on YouTube. We have the revelation of false narratives that were used to promote public policies. With the silence of the grant-dependent academy, we have the intimidation of those who spoke out against the consensus in response to one public health threat. We had great price inflation and the spectacle of prominent academic economists minimizing what was part of people's everyday experience. And we have the ongoing crises of governance and universities as presidents resign and politicians and donors intervene. And as if all that is not enough, we have the events of October 7, 2023, which immediately produced, about 27 clubs at Harvard producing public statements that the Hamas slaughter of Israeli citizens, about 1,200 Israeli citizens, while it was still going on, right? It took the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, 3 days to remove Hamas terrorists from Israel. So it took until October 10th. But on October 7th, right, you had this outburst from approximately 27 different clubs at Harvard blaming the Hamas slaughter of Israeli civilians on Israeli policies. And so you had, in the words of Stephen Turner, an outburst of anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine demonstrations that quickly veered into anti-Semitic and anti-Western directions. You then had the presidents of 3 elite universities testifying before Congress and giving these loyally, carefully crafted excuses that were seen as quite hypocritical about free speech, right? They would defend students calling for genocide of the Jewish state. At the same time, they enforce elaborate regimes prohibiting misgendering and microaggressions and anti-racism. Then you had the president of Stanford, right, being dismissed for research fraud. Then you had the revelations about the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay. Numerous instances of plagiarism and the very low level of her scholarship was revealed. 700 Harvard faculty supported her in a petition, but many donors called for her removal, and she eventually left. So the whole idea of academic freedom was caught up in this crisis. Right, certain perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian war, right, certain opinions were diagnosed as harmful. Just opinions caused harm, right? So this is part of the dominant left liberal hegemony in universities in the first world, that many opinions are now seen as harmful, right? So we have a woke movement to delegitimate the West and whiteness in the name of anti-racism, colonization, and resistance to what's called cognitive imperialism, incarceration, and environmental destruction, all of which is laid at the feet of racialized capitalism. And so the Arab-Israeli war is a convenient fit for this zero-sum theory of oppression. So every group's misery is now the result of another group's privilege and exploitation. So you have one type of speech is promoted, that basically the suffering of all minority groups is the fault of white people, and responses to this dominant discourse are punished. Then there was a reaction in favor of free speech and academic freedom, and it became widely accepted that increasingly academics and people in public life have come to self-censor and to act out of fear to avoid the dislocation of their life. Then you have the US Supreme Court deciding against affirmative action. Then you have universities leading a massive effort to circumvent the ruling and continue affirmative action practices under different terms. In the world of science, you have all these retractions, conflict of interest issues, and financial misdeeds, largely as a result of the metricization of research, valuation, and reward. So science has become increasingly a big business, and applications for grants, often try to meet certain metrics, and in that attempt, right, they're usually creating some kind of artificial competition oriented towards payoffs rather than intellectual content. So there's great financial reward for patents and business deals. At the same time, in the humanities and the social sciences, employment in academic life has become more precarious. So tenure and its freedoms has become rare. So the concept of harm has become the de facto value system in American universities. To ask where one got the authority to pronounce something good or bad, was it self-harmful? It asserted the authority of the harmer over the harmed. But this denial of authority was selective. Only the oppressed or those speaking on them could ever say they were harmed. Now, this perspective never turned into a coherent theory, but that doesn't mean it was not dominant. So here is an interview with the Jolly Heretic, Why Civilizations Collapse into Dust.
Every process pushed to its natural extension destroys itself and becomes something new. And so what happens is that you've had a period of bloodletting, which creates a new period of prosperity. In that period of prosperity, the population grows, and afterwards it grows, and then afterwards you see a labor imbalance where capital and labor are constantly competing with the other, or they're in a reciprocal relationship. And then as labor gets cheaper, it pushes the average value of a person's wages down, and it increases inequality because capital's ability to mobilize labor increases. So you've seen a growth in inequality, and then you see competition for the few good elite jobs. And then what occurs is that the elite breaks into sub-factions, pushing each self-interest. For example, in the French Revolution, the Royalists versus the Jacobins.
Why is there an over-promotion of elites in the first place? Well, how does that process occur?
when you have a society in which there's not enough, when you have a society where there's not enough good, in an unequal society, you have most jobs are terrible and a small amount of good jobs. And thus people compete for the small amount of good jobs because there's a disparity where only a handful of these jobs actually work and most will leave you in poverty. And so there's hyper competition for the good positions in the inequality, which is why in our society, for example, people are getting college degrees, and why people are constantly getting PhDs and master's degrees, which don't lead them anywhere because they're overcompensating for a handful of good jobs that don't exist. And it's also, for example, a major reason why you see diversity and equity jobs, because what's effectively going on there, in my opinion, or at least a major facet of it, is that with these diversity and equity jobs, you can throw merit out the window. And so you can hire mostly people of color, but also the pre-established elites, they can use the obfuscated system to put their children in power because they've removed merit. And it's also a way to hijack the system for leftist ideologues who would, on a purely merit basis, not be able to get these good positions. And so the society splits apart into different self-interests based on certain subgroups of the population. And so in our society, at least in America, I don't know if it's the same in Europe, the breakdown is the college educated versus the non-college educated, where every single policy the left pushes the self-interest of the college educated.
Right, interesting perspective there on the jolly heretic. I need a laugh, so let me play something.
Do Black Lives matter to you? Do Black Lives matter to you? Do Black Lives matter, right, Karen? Fucking white piece of shit, you little fucking pussy-ass bitch! Oh yeah, you wanna fucking go, Karen? No! No! Until Black Lives matter! Until Black Lives matter, no life matters!
Black, white, yellow...
That is not our fight! Until Black Lives mean something to this country! No. No.
She ain't going nowhere, though. She not going nowhere.
Until Black...
What you going to do? She not going nowhere. Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Do Black Lives matter to you? Do Black Lives matter to you? Do Black Lives matter? I care.
Oh, I needed that.
And it is interesting because, you know, I've known you for a long time. We've been talking for a long time, but I have absolutely noticed that in the past 2 years, because of Ukraine and now Israel, that you have a massive online following. When you go and appear on these shows, a lot of people are very interested in what you're saying. And just that alone didn't.
No, that's not what I wanted to play. Man. Here we go.
And you look at that for police, you look at that through economics, through social workers, over religious leaders. Anything you would look for the left does is to give the college-educated bureaucrat more power, while the right pushes the non-college educated elite, whether business, military, or religious interests. And so what's happening is that as the amount of good jobs shrinks, the right and the left fight over, will the resources go to the college educated or the non-college educated? And the previous historic parallels, like let's say from the 14th century or the 15th century, is the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. They were different geographic parts of England. The parliamentarians and the royalists were capitalist versus landed gentry. And across history, you see that there's different, as times get tough, the population splits into different sub-demographics that have civil wars to push their group's interests.
Right. But what would be the opposite? When was there a period where there were enough good jobs? And so you didn't.
So he'll talk about the 1950s. So America was probably at its most cohesive and had the highest public trust after immigration restriction laws were passed in 1924. So between 1920s and the 1960s, that's probably when America had its highest level of social trust. Just watch the documentary series on Amazon 99 about Manchester United's treble when they won the Premier League, they won the FA Cup, and they won the Euro Cup. And they talk about how much fear they had for Alex Ferguson, who was their coach. And so why in much of life do you have dictatorship and hierarchy and authoritarianism, because sometimes it is the most effective way to get things done.
Become a youth team player at Manchester United, it's a whole different thing. It's not about you, it's not about your mum and dad. It's all about Manchester United.
The boss was setting the tone. He was the one that was leading the charge. His cow was here first.
He had that little cough. And if you're walking up the stairs and you heard that, you just walk back down.
My job was to clean the first team bath. There was one day, you know, the cough came down and we shit ourselves. The place was spotless. And he literally climbed up and he put his hand down the back and he just went, "Dead," and walked out.
Saturday mornings, the manager would be stood up against the window and he'd be pacing. You'd see him pace up and down. It was terrifying. Terrifying.
So sometimes you get greater effort out of employees by terrifying them. Right? The reason that you have much of business life and sporting life conducted on hierarchical, terrifying, authoritarian, dictatorial lines is because that's often the best way to get the highest quality effort from employees.
You could feel him stomping down the stairs, and when he did have a go, it was scary.
When I was 15, he obliterated me. You fucking little shit, you'll never play for this football club again. Who do you think you are? You come into this club, all these players in, it's all about you.
It's just aggressive, it's in your face. When the manager tells you you're never going to play for Man United again, you believe him.
The first team felt a million miles away. That's another level. Maybe that's not for me.
Right, they're absolutely terrified of their coach, and that seemed to be an effective strategy.
These happen in rhythmic cycles where the last good time in the Western world was the mid-20th century, where in the mid-20th century, the Western world had very low political stress because because you didn't have to try that hard. Where if you were a genuinely smart person in 1955, you could just get a job. And so you've satiated basically the will to power inside the population. And you can for the longest time, I wanted to make an economic metric about, can you afford to have 3 children in your society? Because I think that's a very important metric, because as I frequently say, humans are designed to breed first and be rational later. And 3 children is fundamentally what you need to maintain your family's replication. And we're in a society where most people can't afford to have any children. And at least with the social standards that we have in the West for quality of life. And so everyone could afford to do that in the 50s. And so if you go back to, if you want to go through these rhythmic cycles, the early 18th century was another good time. The 15th century was, parts of the 19th century were, depending where you were in the Western world. And so it's these alternating rhythms between
what is it that makes it a good time, that people feel that their desire for status is safe?
Wage work, basically wage work versus cost of living, where if you're a normal person, you work at the factory, or work at the factory or the farm, whatever, can you make enough money to support a family comfortably and not be on the edge of survival? Where Peter Turchin's work, he's analyzes about 20 different variables, and a lot of these variables are contiguous across different historic time periods. So, for example,
the reason why in the 50s you were better able to do that than you are now is because the standard of living, the desired material standard of living was lower. Most people didn't go on holiday abroad or go on holiday at all. All of these things that we consider to be essential. Large materialistic Christmases. Roast chicken was something that was expensive.
So when I talk to Orthodox Jews who say spend $25,000, $30,000 per child to send them to an Orthodox day school, right? They often don't get to take these overseas vacations, right? They have to cut down on all other expenses because they put their Orthodox Jewish identity first.
There's an obfuscation
every day.
there's an obfuscation here in that luxury items became cheaper, but quality standard living stuff became more expensive. And Turchin is a great example of this. And I like looking at holistic variables as well as normal stuff like housing, where housing, healthcare, university, food, oil, all the basic essentials were incredibly cheap in the 50s. And also we've seen a push against labor vis-a-vis capital, where the supply for labor has exceeded capital by 40% over the last 50 years. And this has occurred for a significant amount of reasons, whether the supply of foreign immigration, women entering the workforce, automation, globalization. The elites have done every single thing they could do to lower the value of labor, because of course they do. It's inside their direct self-interest. So
Donald Trump was the first American president in 50 years to substantially increase the wages and the income of the least educated Americans, those with just a high school education, those without a high school education. So all the lower levels of American wage earners enjoyed a substantial increase in income under Donald Trump for the first time since the 1960s. So in general, in California, for example, construction wages are at the same place they were in the 1960s. Have you guys seen that Japanese series that's on Netflix called Extremely Inappropriate? All right, it's about going back. This gym teacher who's living in 1986, he boards this bus and he's transported into 2024, and he's shocked at the low wages, the high prices, and the political correctness. So I think this series is called Extremely Inappropriate.
You can look at a bunch of other proxies behind that, besides that, where Turchin has developed 20 different metrics to compute rough well living. And you can see variables like average height, which even among white people has been in decline, average age of marriage, amount of sleep people get, rates of obesity, and rates of deaths of despair. And I like looking at the marriage rates and the deaths of despair rates, because it's impossible to look into someone's soul, but you can find various metrics to determine their general well-being. And at the same time, if it doesn't really matter how poor someone actually is, what matters in the sociological level is how poor they believe themselves to be. Where I went to Egypt 2 years ago, and Egyptians are far poorer than Americans, but they've relatively done better than they were 30 years ago. So Egyptians are happier they're happier with the poorness they have because it's better.
All right, let me just play a little bit from the New York Times here about the show. You can find it on Netflix, Extremely Inappropriate.
A show that makes young Japanese pine for the inappropriate 1980s. This article is by Motoko Rich and Kyuko Notoya and read by an automated voice. The younger generation has frequently called out Japan's entrenched elders for their casual sexism, excessive work expectations, and unwillingness to give up power. But a surprise television hit has people talking about whether the oldsters might have gotten a few things right, especially as some in Japan, like their counterparts in the United States and Europe, question the heightened sensitivities associated with wokeness. The show, Extremely Inappropriate, features a foul-talking, crotchety physical education teacher and widowed father who boards a public bus in 1986 Japan and finds himself whisked to 2024. He leaves an era when it was perfectly acceptable to spank students with baseball bats, smoke on public transit, and treat women like second-class citizens. Landing in the present, he discovers a country transformed by cell phones, social media, and a workplace environment where managers obsessively monitor employees for signs of harassment. The show was one of the country's most popular when its 10 episodes aired at the beginning of the year on TBS, one of Japan's main television networks. It is also streaming on Netflix, where it spent 4 weeks as the platform's #1 show in Japan. Extremely Inappropriate compares the Showa era, which stretched from 1926 to 1989, the reign of Japan's wartime emperor, Hirohito, to the current era, which is known as Reiwa, and began in 2019, when the current emperor Naruhito took the throne.
So who doesn't love a 1980s party? All right, I mean, 1980 seems like an American golden age compared to the current dystopia, and I'm consciously using dystopia in a very exaggerated way.
Both the writer and executive producer are 50-something Generation Xers, whose nostalgia for the more freewheeling bubble years of their youth permeates the ditzy comedic drama, whose characters occasionally break into madcap musical numbers. Not so subtly, the show also comments on the evolution toward more inclusive and accommodating offices, caricaturing them as places where work is left undone because of strict overtime rules, and employees apologize repeatedly for running afoul of compliance rules. Such portrayals strike a chord in Japan, where there have been complaints, often expressed on social media, about political correctness being used as a club to restrict expression or to water down television programs or films. Part of what fans have found refreshing about Extremely Inappropriate is how unrestrained the portions set in the Showa era are. While critics have called the series retrograde, some younger viewers say the show has made them question social norms they once took for granted, and wonder about what has been lost. Writing for an entertainment-oriented web publication, Ryo Otozuki, 25, said that the series must have left many viewers thinking inwardly that the Showa era was more fun. She was initially shocked by some of the 1980s behavior it depicted, she wrote. In an interview, Ms. Otozuki...
So a lot of my peers are absolutely convinced that the time we grew up, 1970s, 1980s, was much more fun.
Suzuki said she was glad not to have grown up in the earlier era after seeing sexual harassment and extreme disciplinary measures portrayed as so normal back then. But she also wondered if people then felt more empowered to make their own choices. She pointed to a television variety program depicted in the show, where young women cavort in skimpy outfits and compete to let their nipples slip out of their shirts, while a male host crawls between their legs making sexually suggestive comments. At first, Ms. Otozuki recoiled from it. In the end, though, she decided that if the stars realized that their bodies are their tools and wanted to use them for entertainment, then she could accept the variety show's approach. Kaori Shoji, an arts critic who was a teenager in the 1980s, said she loved Extremely Inappropriate. She particularly appreciated how the series illuminated the chilling effects of today's tighter policing of workplaces. Everyone is just playing a game to see who can be the least offensive person that ever walked the earth, Ms. Shoji said. Everyone just exchanges platitudes and inanities because they are afraid to say anything. Surely that cannot be good for a workplace. The show pays homage to Back to the Future, the classic movie about a 1980s-era teenager, played by Michael J. Fox, who travels back in time to the 1950s of his parents' adolescence. In Extremely Inappropriate, the point of view is primarily that of the parent traveling to the future, Ichiro, played by the Japanese character actor Sadao Abe. Some other characters, including a feminist sociologist and her teenage son, travel back in time, while Ichiro's rebellious teenage daughter spends an episode in the future getting to know a television producer and single mother who struggles to balance her work and personal life.
All right, that's the show on Netflix from Japan called Extremely Inappropriate. All right, interesting discussion here with the Jolly Heretic. Why civilizations collapsed into dust.
Our parents had. Well, Americans are vastly wealthier than Egyptians, but our expectations are higher. And in America, if you pull a third world or pull a pre-industrial and keep 6 kids in a one-room house and like have a single pair of clothes for them, the police will be called on you. Like your kids will get taken away, or you'll be socially outcasted at the very least. And so it's the perceived economic utility of the people in the society versus what their expectations are.
I see.
I would like to address something briefly. In many of my videos, I talk about our evolutionary backgrounds sent off.
Yeah, my parents were school teachers, and they bought their house for about double a teacher's salary in 1982, and the teacher's salary has now probably doubled since then, but the house has gone up, but sort of 6-fold. So you can't. There's no way that 2 school teachers these days could buy that house.
So on a rational, empirical basis, obviously there are plenty of ways that life is better today than it was in 1980s, and there are other ways that it's worse, other ways it's not clear, depending on your politics and your predispositions. All right, you're going to be better suited for one environment or another. Okay, I put in the title, right, today's show, Decoding the Trump Conviction, Ukraine, Israel, Science, Liberalism, the Academy. Did I say anything about Ukraine today? But might as well live up to Should Liberalism Die? Play a few excerpts from a discussion here between Bo Weingart and Noah Kahl on Aporia magazine, Substack.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
maybe the group prefers to be smaller or to cease existing.
To not exist. Yeah. Yes. Right. I agree. So like when we're attributing intentions to groups, it's a tricky business, and perhaps one would say it's.
Well, it's not a tricky business if you are used to a group orientation. All right. If you come from Korea, China, or Japan, or you're an Orthodox Jew, you would understand being part of a group that puts group interests first.
One is guilty of like some kind of rhetorical legerdemain to speak this way. I don't exactly think so, because I still think groups replicate themselves in the same way that individuals do, or in the same way that ideas do. So I think we could speak about the interests of ideas, and some ideas replicate better than other ideas. And of course, Dawkins called this a meme, which has become itself a meme. I'm not saying I subscribe to an entire meme theory, but I think it's plausible enough, useful way to talk. I think the same applies to groups. So yeah, maybe all of the individuals want the group to perish. That would still be bad for the group. If one were thinking of it from the group's perspective, it would be a bad thing if it stopped existing.
I mean, but that's just based on an assumption. It's not based on any kind of evidence concerning the revealed or stated preference of the group.
Well, obviously, most members of a group would prefer the group keep existing.
Example that you could speak of the interests of a sports team, and that sometimes the interests of the sports team contradict the interest of individual players on the team.
What would be an example?
So we'll take basketball. Maybe you're not as familiar with it, but I think it works. It's the easiest one for this. So in basketball, perhaps you would say, okay, a player would like to score as many points as possible. It increases his stats. That might lead to a bigger contract. But maybe he starts taking shots that are more inefficient. And so the team would like him to stop taking shots, because the team's interest is in winning, not in getting a big contract next year. So in that way, the team's interests are somewhat contradictory to the individual's interests.
I see. Wouldn't it make sense to say that the other player's interests?
So I'm just thinking back to the excerpt from Christopher Caldwell's essay that I was reading about Israel and its settlements. So there was a long, exhaustive, thoroughly reported New York Times Sunday magazine essay on the bad behavior of Israeli settlers. But I don't believe that survival, right, the survival of Israel, was once mentioned in that piece. So this piece is a product of the liberal worldview, where the most important thing is the individual and the individual's inalienable rights. But what about the survival of the group? So from the perspective of this New York Times piece, it's the illiberal behavior of West Bank settlers that threatens the survival of the Jewish state. But what about having a state that is very difficult to defend without Jewish settlements on the West Bank, right? That didn't come up. So these pragmatic questions of survival, right, don't seem to figure often in the liberal worldview. And so that states would pursue policies that it can't write down, that it can't publicly defend, but that it pursues unofficially because it's in their survival best interest, it doesn't usually get a fair shake in the liberal perspective. But obviously, it seems to me, I guess I'm a nationalist, I'm a tribalist, right? I understand why many people and many groups would put their highest priority on survival. And if it enhances Israel's survival, for example, to take control of Gaza and to maintain robust settlements on the West Bank, then even if Israel can't justify these policies officially, right, I would expect Israel or any state to pursue its best interests and its survival over conformity to a liberal worldview.
Were being overridden by...
I think I would be happy enough to go that route, probably. I think my ontology includes groups. I actually think I'm a Durkheimian in that sense, and that I really do think there's something called like a social fact, which is different from and irreducible to the individual psychologies of the members of that group. Nevertheless, I'm not dogmatic about that, and I don't think it matters that much as long.
But Ukraine wants to fight because it's in Ukraine's interests to defeat the Russians. Seems to me a very misleading statement. Rather, a certain number of individuals in Ukraine want to fight. A certain number of...
Yeah, so this is an excellent rejoinder to the group perspective.
Individuals are being conscripted. Some, perhaps many of those individuals don't want to fight and are actively fleeing or being arrested for their defiance. So that kind of statement can be profoundly misleading, I think.
Yeah, and in fact, that's a point that Meander makes in the dialogue, which is that talking about group interests is often like a kind of, it degenerates into a kind of chauvinistic romanticism, whereby the nation becomes the most important thing and its interests are more valuable than individual interests. I guess what I would say, just to put my final point on this, unless you want to continue on it, I think of it as like a traffic jam. So like if you think of a traffic jam, yes, a traffic jam is composed of individual cars, and in some sense you might say, well, the individual cars are what's real. Nevertheless, a traffic jam is an emergent phenomenon, an emergent property of a bunch of vehicles at the same time trying to do something or whatever. And if we wanted to understand the world and we removed all talk about traffic jams, it would be very difficult to describe what happens on the highway at rush hour.
Yeah, so it's a useful shorthand in the domain of human communication, but as philosophers, we need to be careful about, separating utility from accuracy.
Well, so this might be a difference in our respective philosophical commitments, because I'm an ontological pragmatist. So what I would argue is that ultimately...
Okay, press 1 in the chat if you are an ontological pragmatist. I mean, I got to be honest, I am afraid to walk the streets of Beverly Hills these days because of the threat of these roving bands of ontological pragmatists. Very scary characters. Stephen Turner wrote a terrific essay published in a 2021 book called Pandemics, Politics and Society, Critical Perspectives on the COVID-19 Crisis. And he quotes from David Brooks, said this in 2020. Aside from a few protesters and a depraved President Trump, most of us have understood we need to suspend the old individualist American creed. In the midst of a complex epidemiological disaster, to be anti-authority is to be ignorant. So in the name of an emergency, real or imagined, right, all our rights can be taken away. So who decides when we're in a state of emergency? Right, the sovereign. And if the sovereign or the governor of a state can declare an emergency and have the state enforcement apparatus support that declaration, and citizens by and large fall in line, then the sovereign, the governor, right, he is sovereign, right? He decides what's law and what rights we are allowed to have. So Thomas Hobbes had this famous line, it is authority, not truth, that makes the law. And if you can make the argument that the experts tell us that we're in a state of emergency, then you essentially have rule by experts. And the experts have decreed that many traditional rights that we have to freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, right, are to be taken away. And I, by and large, in retrospect, agreed with most public health measures to combat COVID, but I still want to be clear that the invocation of a state of emergency, real or imagined, can take away all our rights. So in the perspective that David Brooks gave, essentially truth and authority are one, truth and expertise are one. To be opposed to the experts, to be opposed to our governing class, right, is not merely to be rebellious or to be independent. It means that you are ignorant.
The ontology that allows us best to describe the world is real. And if that includes the entity group, then so be it.
But I would say that while in the case of the traffic jam, it doesn't impede our understanding, may even help it. In the case of something like conscription during a war, it actively impedes our understanding, and the group does need to be reduced to its individual elements for proper understanding.
That's a fair point, yeah. So you would argue that in some sense it actually distorts our understanding.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that makes an entity have interest is surely the fact that it has an individual consciousness.
No, I don't agree with that, because then you would say, like, I think it makes perfect sense to say trees have interest or frogs have interest. I don't know if frogs have consciousness.
Well, I would concede, to get back to your essay, those are just, an alternative.
Humans are born utterly dependent on other people, and their very sense of self, in fact, is created by their relations with other people. And just to give, like, what's the most obvious example, language. So I happen to believe that to have any kind of consciousness, worth talking about, you would need a symbolic awareness, and symbolic awareness comes through language. Now, language is a system that you're born into. You have to learn. So in that sense, this is actually like very structuralist and then post-structuralist or postmodern, but still, I think it's plausible enough that language is it's a system that precedes any individual, and an individual without language is not really an individual. So, the proverbial person born on a desert island who never learns a language, the wild child, as it were, would not have a kind of consciousness or identity that we would recognize as fundamentally human. The person.
Okay, back to this Stephen Turner, Carl Schmittian analysis. So what is normal and who decides when we're in a normal or abnormal or a disaster? Right, so from David Brooks' perspective, like scientific experts decide when we're in a state of emergency. Right, so what creates this distinction between the normal, when you can have legal norms, and the abnormal situation in which you have a suspension of the legal order, that this suspension of the normal legal order is necessary to preserve the state. So in this moment, right, we see the naked state, the state in the act of being itself, without the drapery of superficial justifications. Right, when the police come to quell a riot, we see the naked state. The normal rules are suspended, orders are given, and they are enforced by direct physical violence. And this is continued until order is restored. But this suspension of the normal rules tells us about the normal, that the normal is the absence of an emergency, the absence of a riot, but the possibility of an emergency or the possibility of a riot is always present. So the normal cannot be relied upon to perpetuate itself, right? Democracy is not going to perpetuate itself purely with democracy, because democracy will encounter challenges that will upend and destroy a state unless a democracy moves to a different system of government. Right? The exception, the state of emergency, serves to do what the normal rules fail to do. Right? In a crisis, the normal rules are not sufficient, right, to keep order. Right? So you're in a state of exception. So you need rule by decree or by order. So what are the conditions of normality? And what are the conditions of the emergency? So in the United States, the state of emergency is usually done through a complicated series of indirect administrative means. You get advisory letters, which say we do not need the normal processes for rules. You have these little exceptions. You have the expansion of discretionary powers. So public health officials in each county of California have enormous power, right? You're the head of public health in each of California's 58 counties. You can shut down pretty much any business or any social gathering if you believe we're in a state of emergency. And COVID gave us a state of emergency, and what it revealed is the power of experts. So there is a tripart relationship here between expertise, the state, and the public. And in this crisis, the relations were clear. Governments relied on experts, who I believe were generally correct, at least 80% correct, right, on the need for lockdown, the need for social distancing, and the need for vaccines. Right? Then the experts have legitimacy apart from their formal roles. Right? The public accepts their role, or state authority is called in to demand behavior that conforms with state authority. Right? The experts depend upon the state to enforce their pronouncements and to recognize them as experts. It takes experts to tell us who experts are, right? You only know who the experts are because other experts say that they're experts. So in normal circumstances, this three-legged stool of the state, the public, and the experts is stable and invisible. Right? The public feels secure in the discretionary powers of the state, and the policies are being carried out in accordance with both expert knowledge and the rules of the game. And usually experts are faceless and they are unknown to the public, and their disagreements and the precarious and often dubious nature of their expertise is not known. So you have a relationship of trust, and the state and the experts pretend to rule in the interests of the people. So you have this hidden relationship between the public, the experts, and the state. The public does not revolt against the state in normal times. The experts do not denounce the state, and the state does not defund the experts or restrict them. Right? The public does not disbelieve the experts, the state, or the mass media. The experts, in turn, do not directly deny what the public knows. The state does not directly assault the public or deny its competence to judge it. So in a crisis, the stool becomes unstable. Right? Each leg has its own destabilizing tendencies, which become apparent only in crises. Right? The public is a myth that gets represented to itself and to the state by the news media. Right? The state has a labyrinthine complexity. It is barely intelligible except when it acts, and its acts are usually inscrutable by design. And expertise, by definition, is a mystery to those who do not possess it. So pandemics and epidemics are frequent occurrences, and there are normal procedures for dealing with them. But what works in a normal procedure is not going to work in a state of emergency. So medical knowledge is far short of scientific knowledge, right? Medical knowledge is constantly adapted to individual circumstances, and it's always short of full understanding of a complex biological process. In observational epidemiology, case is even more difficult, right? This is standard social science causal modeling with statistics and the usual problems of confounding and multiple causes. So this field has been in crisis for decades. So we often saw during recent public health emergency that many of the pronouncements of the public health officials were wildly inaccurate. So how do you preserve trust, right? Normally disagreements are aired privately and they are dealt with, right? You have bureaucratic infighting in the background. Some voices get a larger say than others. So the normal process of expertise and government is done silently, right? When the system works, right, dissent among experts is suppressed. But behind these organizational niceties lies the reality of patronage. So we have a court case after the Katrina disaster. An obscure engineering researcher at Louisiana State University criticized the Army Corps of Engineers, which was responsible for the levee that failed and flooded much of the city of New Orleans. And he criticized the Army Corps for its errors. The university, encouraged by its own professors, had the researcher fired. Right, the case went to court, was eventually settled with a payment to the researcher. But it's the issue that's important, right? The researcher's criticisms were judged by the university and its professors as making precarious its government funding. And so we have a similar situation with the CDC, right? The CDC hands out millions and billions of dollars in grants. If you criticize the CDC, all right, it's going to place your funding in doubt.
Would simply lack those qualities.
It seems like a strong claim. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I mean,
Well, as I say, it's the bold one. Yeah.
Yeah. If you went to a foreign country and you didn't have a phone with Google Translate with you, or a a guidebook with a list of popular phrases, you could presumably still get by. You kind of you would use gestures, and you'd say, if you wanted the time, you'd point at your wrist and things like that. You could still communicate in a very primitive way. So do you mean language, or do you mean all communication?
Well, I mean all symbolic communication. So if you were the only person in the world, I don't think you would develop symbolic consciousness. Symbolic consciousness, as Michael Tomasello and other people have argued, obviously our brains are prepared to develop symbolic consciousness, but it actually requires interaction with other symbolically conscious agents, namely other humans. So, I mean, obviously it's incredibly difficult because you can't do a randomized control experiment where you put people away and you prevent them from having any interaction with other humans. But there are some quite unfortunate cases of people who have lived virtually without human interaction, and they seem to have intelligences and consciousnesses that are so foreign to our own that we really can't even comprehend them.
Okay, so suppose one accepts that line of argument. It seems a bit of a leap to then say that it's a distortion to call the individual with his own consciousness the unit of analysis in society. I mean, is then the language group the unit of analysis?
I guess the Philo claim would be that the family and then the community, that they are actually more real than any individual that you would pluck out. So trying to think of like the best. Yeah. So if that's the case, if it's because I think people are, this I do agree with. I'm not even trying to be sympathetic to Philo here. I think people are ignorant for obvious reasons of how much of their own sense of self and their own interest, etc., their own beliefs about the world are predominantly caused by their cultural context. And this is one of my objections to the notion of authenticity and being yourself or whatever, is like yourself is a creation of, it's an interaction between, biological predispositions and your culture. I mean, there's no such thing as like an authentic self that would be the same in the year 4000 BCE that it is now, right? So in that sense, if we want to understand, like say a person, we take one person, we're like, okay, we want to understand Martin Luther. We really can't do that unless we understand the context in which Martin Luther became a conscious being and what he was rebelling against, etc. I guess that would be I would be willing to defend that. I wouldn't go as far as Philo personally. But.
Yeah. So in the first few months of 2020, the Centers for Disease Control and Anthony Fauci failed to recognize the severity of the COVID virus, in large part for reasons intrinsic to the problem of detection, the limits of scientific knowledge available, and the need to make judgments about it. So the founders of public health medicine have declared that it is part science, part art. So in other words, it's part science, part guesswork. Okay, so the CDC asserted exclusive power over the provision of COVID detection kits at the beginning of the crisis, and then it developed kits which were faulty because of contamination in manufacturing. So the kits were found to be faulty by another powerful agency, the Food and Drug Administration. So this embarrassing failure led to the loss of the control of the CDC over the process and to open expression of distrust of the work of the CDC by Deborah Birx. So with this failure, you got public disputes between experts. And in contrast to past pandemics, right, you had the facade of unified expert agreement ripped apart. So now you had diverse expert opinions aired, different policies around the United States were adopted, different policies in different countries were adopted. So what was usually kept private was made public, hence the naked state. You had private foundations entering the fray with their own programs and their own research agendas. You had recommendations such as for masking given and withdrawn and given again. You had projections made and failing to be fulfilled. You had politically volatile directions which revolved around the availability of ventilators, which were thought to be crucial for care, but turned out to be not particularly helpful, if not deadly. You had all sorts of departures from the normal, revealing the operation of the naked state. Right? The pandemic demanded immediate answers, not something that the science system normally delivers. This is particularly true for the medical science system. The science has an elaborate system of social control, which usually operates with multiple redundant mechanisms or designed to produce conformity. Right? The peer review system for grants is one. It's closely connected with status hierarchy, educational hierarchy, with the degree system, the certification and licensing system, various bureaucratic systems and protocols, including the institutional research boards, which approve research and privacy protocols for human subjects. You have drug approval agencies, which normally demand years of testing and an encyclopedia-length application for approval. So the whole system, particularly of publication, usually depends upon peer review and is often quite slow. Now all these systems get challenged in the crisis. You have preprints and unreviewed papers getting published. You have clinicians and outsiders to the medical research hierarchy presenting research results without the usual barriers. Retractions became common. You had important figures such as John Ioannidis, the medical statistician, promoting certain pieces of research and then getting savaged in the elite press for taking funding from right-wing sources. So the dirty linen of science was exposed to public view, along with the clashing claims and opinions of many different scientists. Then you had an effort to suppress views that differed from the elite scientists. So science became nakedly political. You had two studies appear in major journals, the Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, supporting the contention that the familiar and notably safe anti-malarial drug that Donald Trump had touted was, in fact, unsafe and useless. And so research into this drug was immediately halted. Public statements were given by official agencies. Then it turned out the articles, which had been rushed into print without review, without availability of data, and were kept priority and kept secret, the data was, right, at least in one case, had to be embarrassingly retracted. And then these retractions were presented as exceptions. So you had retraction, shoddy research, and the use of data and research to advance interests that were not necessarily aligned with the public interest. So the leg of expertise in this stool failed. Right? Expertise needs a facade, needs to hide or prevent disagreements among the experts. Right? These disagreements are normal, but they're usually kept from becoming public. So instead, you had a choice of policies driving the choice of experts. You had governments who imposed draconian lockdowns, appealing to one set of experts who gave the most dire predictions. Then those predictions failed. So you then had experts who predicted a second wave. The governors who opted to reopen their state appealed to a different set of experts who rejected the first experts' predictions on the basis that there was insufficient high-quality evidence to support the interpretation of the disease that the lockdowns depended on. And then the differences of COVID severity between states also reflected the severity of the outbreak there and the location. So 2/3 of the deaths occurred in a geographically small portion of the country, most heavily in New York City and environments. And in the rest of the country, a large proportion of the deaths were in nursing homes. So you had, in real time, dramatic expert failure. So the expert leg of the stool could not bear the weight, and it shifted to the other two legs, and the whole illusion of expert apoliticality was destroyed, right? The experts chose sides, and the public and the politicians chose experts who fit their preferences. Then you had the frequent failures of prediction and inconsistencies in the claims made by COVID experts and politicians that were instantly recorded and monitored on the web.
But I think he makes a provocative case, I guess, is how I would put it.
Yeah, because you then say, writing as I think Philo, that communities are real because they precede and indeed produce individuals. Yeah. This seems like something that could be inconsistent with strong versions of like hereditarianism, or at least a sort of hereditarian informed view of the world.
Well, that's interesting because I think so I don't think you have to reject hereditarianism to accept that view, because what you would say is like, okay, if we're looking at variance within the community, we can look at genes, but all genetic analysis sort of accepts the milieu as a given.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so yeah,
that has to be the
individual heritability statistics refer to a specific time and place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
okay,
I think the hereditarian Philo would say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's an example of a case where a liberal polity would implement a policy that would lead to bad consequences insofar as it had wrongly construed the individual as a unit of analysis, where it should have construed the group as the unit of analysis?
No, that's an excellent question, because that gets to like, how much is this actually practically important and how much of it is just this kind of bookish debate about philosophy? I think a lot of it is bookish, which is okay. I mean, it's fun to debate philosophy, and intellectuals like to think about these things. Nevertheless, I do think it has practical consequences or applications. So the idea, for example, that the individual is in the best sort of position, the privileged positions to make decisions about his or her own life. I think somebody coming from Philo's perspective would argue that that's a distortion of reality, and that in fact, individual freedom is sort of an epiphenomenon. And not only that, but because individuals' own like propensities and desires are somewhat created by the culture that they inhabit, we should think a lot about what our culture, what kinds of desires our culture is creating. And in fact, this would lead to a anti-liberal criticism of consumerism, for example. Perhaps like you could take this position, you would say, because like well, let's take the extreme libertarian position on this, which I find baffling, but it's essentially advertising doesn't create any kind of desire. Rather, what it does is it gives people information about products. That would be the extreme. I'm not saying many libertarians hold that, but I've definitely talked to a libertarian or two who thought that was the case. So that's extreme libertarianism. I think the extreme like economic progressive would say advertising literally creates like sort of out of the abyss of nothingness, as it were, totally new desires, which humans maybe have never had before.
Yeah, but we did not evolve to be gullible, so I'm suspicious about the vast nefarious qualities of advertising. Right, why civilizations turn to dust? Let me play a little bit more.
Society, where, for example, as of now, the U.S. government, the U.S. government's pushing all this artificial money into the economy to maintain social stability, but at the same time, that ends up in places like the stock market or real estate, which lowers the quality of life for normal people. But as to get to your question, I believe there are a couple important similarities between the French Revolution and the modern Western world. I think especially so America, in that it always shocks me people don't realize that you have a ruling class which is completely disconnected from the populace and pretty stupid, and they don't comprehend that there is this giant demographic of young men who are basically incapable of achieving the things that they want for life, and the elite ritually humiliates them in every way possible. But in America, at least, the demographic that is being put down by the society is exceptionally well armed. And if you look at red versus blue America, conservative America, it has the military, the police, the gun owners, veterans, it has all the natural terrain and the geographic majority of the country. And so it always shocks me to compare how the elites just completely disconnected from the
haven't they made a lot of efforts to wokeify the police, to wokeify the army and infiltrate it with woke ideas? Surely they have, haven't they?
In the military in the U.S., the upper brass of the military has been wokeified while the ranks themselves tilt conservative. And it's comparable to the French and the Russian revolutions, where before those conflicts, the top ranks of the military were royalists while most of the soldiers were pro-revolutionaries. And so when the revolution started, people listened to their colonels who agreed with them and were identifiable, not to the generals or admirals. And the other thing is that in America, young men tilt 2 or 3 to 1 conservative to progressive. So young men are most of the fight in wars. Young men are the ones who fight. So if young men as a general tilt conservative, that means you have a massive imbalance of force. And just on a practical level, the left thinks masculinity, militarism, hierarchy, discipline, using force are moral wrongs. And it's hard to have a war when you think all these things are morally objectionable.
Well, but they were prepared to go in and physically arrest the January 6th protesters and that sort of thing and put them in prison. I mean, that's using force. It's
one of my friends, Kurt Doolittle, I think he's one of the most important thinkers of our time, and he's developed this whole theory that the left is toxic femininity, and it's really brilliant. And one of the points he makes is the left's main strategy is baiting into hazard. The left acts in a covert way to try to trigger the right to do something dumb so that it can then use legal force to say the right is dangerous and wipe out the right. And in situations, the left is willing to use force on a minimal basis in order to ensure their power, yet on a larger scale, they fold. Where, for example, they won't evict the homeless from city centers, or how do you orchestrate a military operation among leftists? No one in their they don't have anyone in their coalition who would fight except ethnic minorities, and I can't really imagine woke commanders organizing black soldiers. It's just too much of a cultural difference. And there's no part of the left's ideology that allows them to to actually use force upon their enemies.
Yeah, I suppose they use things like financial punishment and.
Okay, let me go back to this discussion on liberalism. The main speaker is Bo Weingard, and his interlocutor is Noah Call.
So I think this actually is a case where it does depend on one's view of the fundamental unit of society. If you think individuals are these sort of autonomous agents with a nature that precedes culture, you would be quite skeptical of the claim that advertising could create new desires.
Right. So I think generally speaking, on the right, there's more of a group and national orientation, while on the left, you have more of an individualist orientation. But then certainly communism and socialism is very corporate and not individualist. So I'm not sure that idea stands up.
But so what would be an example of a policy that a post-liberal would object to because it had
about liberalism is that it values freedom over other perhaps equally valuable things. I think drug laws, that's a good example of a domain in which the libertarian has very different views from somebody who's
so the classical liberal places the individual at the center of things. The further you go left and right, the more likely you are to have a corporate group consciousness.
Post-liberal, and who thinks that, you know what, maybe it's not a wise idea just to allow individuals to make whatever choice they want. Or pornography, maybe another example like that.
Yeah, in the case of drug laws, the argument goes that people who become addicted to drugs and ruin their lives not only ruin their own lives, but also those of their family and their neighbors.
So I think the one thing I've ever said or written that's gotten the most currency on the web is that everything we do affects other people, right? Everything has externalities.
Members of their community. And therefore, it's if you take into account these wider interests, you might actually not legalize drugs.
Well, but yeah.
But the reply from the liberal or at least a liberal-minded person would be that, that all makes sense. It doesn't mean that the community has an interest. It means this individual is imposing costs on other people in his community, and those need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah,
it's always individuals that are being affected.
Well, that's one reason I think you could argue that there's an inconsistency or a fundamental challenge at the heart of liberalism, which is it takes individuals as the fundamental unit, the sort of autonomous agent of the political system. But if you really think about it, any society is like a fine spider web where whatever happens in one place vibrates to every other place. So you could say that what you just said about drugs holds for every behavior. Any behavior, like even behavior that's quote unquote in my own bedroom, has consequences for the mating market, which affect other people. It might have consequences for who gets angry at whom, which also affects other people, etc. So in some sense, I would argue, even if you accept the argument that you forwarded, which was an attempt to defend liberalism, it does point to a contradiction or at least a challenge within the very ideology of liberalism.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's a good way of putting it. I guess the only thing that I personally find difficult to accept is the notion that they're a group interest. But certainly I agree that...
Yeah, so that would be like accepting... So basically one could accept the ontology of liberalism, or post-enlightenment classical liberalism, we'll call it, I guess, and then argue that the libertarian liberalism is fundamentally flawed precisely because it doesn't accept that everything a person does inevitably affects other people in the same society.
Yeah, so a libertarian, or not necessarily libertarian, but a liberal-minded economist, political economist, would say that all these behaviors have externalities.
Right. Right.
Now,
but the thing is, every behavior has an externality.
That's
right.
my point.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
So you can accept the framework of liberalism, or at least its formalization in a domain like political economy, and reject it almost all the policy prescriptions, or at least want to tweak them substantially.
I mean, but it almost does get to the point where what you're doing is rejecting the notion that like there are that individual. I mean, it's like the individuals are so closely connected in this view of the world, which I think is the correct view, that they're not independent because everything they do affects other individuals.
But even if one took that view, one would have to concede that some transactions involve far lower externalities than others, and that there's quantitative differences that need to be accounted for by the policymaker.
Yes, I think that's important. Yeah, absolutely. And you could argue that some become so small, like if I watch Clue when I'm eating dinner, or if I watch Seven, really doesn't matter. like,
well, I'm absolutely torn right now between this highbrow discussion from Aporia magazine and this middlebrow but exciting discussion between the Jolly Heretic and Reggie Lynch.
And social ostracism, sort of female tactics. As opposed to traditional male tactics. So all right, that's the point. Yeah. So you've got a young men who are increasingly feeling that they can't get what they want, and that they couldn't be argued that the kind of men that have a bit of conscientiousness, a bit of intelligence, and a bit of get up and go, they'll be much more likely to get what they want, and it will be the kind of men that can be distracted via bread and circuses or very realistic porn or computer games that don't get what they want, and they're not going to have much get up and go to fight anyway.
So if you look at these wars and revolutions, what you generally find is most of the population is apathetic. Where before the English Civil War is a really fascinating example of this, in that before the English Civil War, most people said, we don't want a war. It's same with the American Revolution or the US Civil War. Then what happens is that you have small cadres of radicals who push the populace, and normal people never organize. So when war comes, their opinions largely don't matter. And so you see in the Russian Civil War, the radical Jacobins, who made up less than 3% of Russia's population at the start, win. Sorry, the Bolsheviks win. For the French Revolution, the Jacobins, which are also like 1 or 2% of France's population, won. In America, the radical Republicans went out in the Civil War. They were a tiny part of the population. Same thing again with the Puritans, who were 10% of England's population, who won. Hardcore revolutionary sentiment in America was not big before the revolution. So tiny groups of radicals.
So it's not so much that it fits in with I don't know if you've read Nima Parvini's book, The Populist Delusion. It's not so much that you have a large number of men who are pissed off. It's that you have men, a group of men within the elite that are pissed off, that can draw upon the pissed off populace and mobilize.
And what I expect to happen in America is that we have because if you look at these crises, they normally start with a budget issue or an external war. That's the case with the French Revolution, English Civil War, French medieval and early modern wars, etc. And what I expect to happen, you see the U.S. is constantly renewing its budgets every few months, and the debt's getting to an insane level. And so my top bet is that past a certain point, the Republicans, someone realizes that they have a higher chance of getting reelected if they start a war than if they don't start a war. And frankly, I look at the US debt in the immigration. I don't think we can go another 4 years without having a war, because you just won't have a country left. And the left has been using short-term strategies to please the insane people at the heart of their coalition at the expense of the rest of their coalition. And so there's a couple.
So have you guys seen the new Civil War movie? It's quite compelling. Doesn't have any noticeable ideological component, but certainly kept my attention.
Triggers, with the debt being one, foreign immigration being another, an external war being another, and there's like 5 more. I don't know exactly which one, but what I expect to happen is that the red states and the blue states, the red states form an independent government in Texas. Other red states support them, and the fascinating thing is that when Texas said no to Washington, the other 25 other states said they supported Texas over Washington in a 1-day period, and 10 of those states offered military support to Texas. And in that they said they'd send their soldiers to Texas to fight for Texas. And the fact that it all happened in a single day. And for wars, you see how many dominoes can fall at once, where there were about 15 places where World War I nearly started before it started. And what that signifies to me is that World War I had to happen. It was just looking for a place where the match could get lit. And once I see that many dominoes fall in a row, it means that there's an underlying energy there that's going to get tapped. I'm sorry, it's taking me a second to actually get to your point. What I expect to happen, small groups of radicals in each faction will conscript the normies. And so you'll basically have right-wing and left-wing ideological new elites form, and they will conscript normal guys off the bar floor who don't want to fight.
Right. Okay. And how does this? So, what was this day? This specific day when 25 states sided with Texas? When was this?
That was with Greg Abbott's border issue, where Biden has been letting 15 million or 10, 8, whatever. We don't have good numbers. Biden has let between 8 to 15 million immigrants cross the border because he just let go of the border, and Texas didn't like that. And so Texas sent a letter to the U.S. government saying, we will block the border if you don't. And this breaks the U.S. Constitution because states aren't allowed to block a foreign border. But then Texas sued the centralized government saying, you're not doing your duty, so we have to. And then within the next day of that, half the states in the country said that they supported Texas in doing this. And then Biden folded and backed down on the issue and let Texas block its border.
Oh, okay.
All right, Black Pigeon Speaks did a video on
Donald
this.
Trump has been found guilty in what he calls his show trial or his rigged trial. And many are convinced that the justice system, along with all the other components of government, are so thoroughly corrupt as to be beyond redemption, and that the system has made sure that they know that we know, but they simply don't care. And when a population loses faith in its institutions that manage the society, well, that society will no longer function. And they know that. And again, they simply do not care. There's a lot of talk about secession and civil war in the United States, so much so that even Hollywood has gotten into the fray with the recently released film Civil War. But how likely is such a scenario? Well, there was a poll released very recently that came to some very startling results. Half of Americans expect a second U.S. Civil War within years. More than 40% with the Great Replacement Theory, which we are told, of course, via the...
So a lot of people yearn for excitement. And so obviously the prospects of a civil war, provide meaning and excitement for people who don't have normal human ties.
Mainstream media, Wikipedia, and social media companies, well, it's just a conspiracy theory. But also that nearly a fifth, well, they would choose to bring a gun to a violent political row. Moreover, more than 40% of Americans favor a strong leader over democracy and adhere.
Well, people are going to look out for their self-interest. So if people think that their own best interests and their own quality of life is better served by a more authoritarian leader, then that's what they'll support.
To the belief that an immigrant takeover in the United States is happening now. Now, before we take a look at our serious and massive polarization forces currently ripping the United States apart from within. While Joe Biden calls America a beacon for the world, what he absolutely misses is that in reality, it is an empire in steep decline. America is a country now marked...
And I think this is bogus, right? Most people don't care about politics that intensely. America is not an empire in decline. Yeah, the quality of life and the amount of social cohesion, social trust has dropped significantly.
With Venezuela-tier elections, a corrupt judiciary, a bot...
All right, I think both of these are just absurd exaggerations.
...and paid-for government, institutional backing of lawlessness, growing and visible poverty, as well as studies showing an unprecedented collapse of societal conditions.
Yeah, so as we have more diversity, right, you'd have more income inequality and less social cohesion, less social trust.
Within the United States. Or, if I can put it more simply, a lot of people believe that the nation is headed toward a failed state. And not only that, but that America is a failed experiment that is teetering on the brink of civil war. What is true is that when using the common metrics that political scientists use to determine the signs of a failing state, well, the US checks many of those boxes. In fact, studies have shown that much of...
Well, out of all the world's major economies, the United States economy is doing best by a large margin.
...of the illusion of democracy is just that, an illusion. So about this study... Well, after a rigorous analysis of voting from 1982 until 2002, a study entitled Testing Theories of American Politics, Elite Interest Groups, and Average Citizens, well, this study showed that the preferences of the top 10% of Americans routinely trumped those of the average voter. Moreover, that the bedrock white-black narrative of America misses the point. In America, things do not only relate to racial issues, but especially ones of class, and that more and more people, no matter their race, are finding life harder and harder and harder. Poverty is accelerating, civil discourse is breaking down, social cohesion has evaporated. Americans have become extremely complacent to the idea that their current living arrangements are the norm rather than the exception, and the elites, for their part, believe that any manner of social or economic trauma can be publicly ghosted or ignored by the sheer inertia of American power. Power that many suggest is now running on fumes. Looking internationally, there was the complete and total humiliation in Afghanistan with the abandonment of $80 billion in military.
Right. Foreign policy catastrophes are not going to cause a civil war at home.
Equipment combined with the ongoing failure in Ukraine and the inability to curb either Russia or China. And for that matter, just this week, China has surrounded the island of Taiwan with little to no response from the US Navy. In the country itself, well, there's the usual domestic summer rioting season coming up.
Right. Not responding to Chinese provocation doesn't show that you're weak. It's probably just superior judgment.
To a presidential election that is germinated and magnified with glee.
Yeah, I like what Stephen J. James says in the chat. I just find all this distant right crap so uncompelling these days. Don't know what's happened to me.
By the mainstream media, a media that has completely lost all credibility with those that it is paid to influence.
Right, some parts of the media have lost credibility with some parts of the population, but still over 2 million people, including myself, pay to subscribe to the New York Times. But this guy does have some good points to make a little later in this video. So let's fast forward.
Old customs and old habits, they have absolutely nothing to replace them with. And at this point, the intergenerational contract has been ripped up and thrown to the floor. And in our era, where the dogmatic currency shifts by the day, and emerging anti-human concepts percolate from the depths of social science departments across the country and then are promulgated by the controlled media, what is actually occurring is the attempted transformation in what the famed zoologist Desmond Morris called the human animal. The politics of division are only intensifying, and people are now grouping themselves along political lines even more strongly than by any other distinction. Americans are now not only encouraged to separate themselves.
So more and more of my friends who are right-wing and Orthodox Jews are moving out of California, mainly to Florida, but also to Texas and Nevada.
Along uncountable lines of distinction, but also to extol the virtue of celebrating these differences and call it a strength. And when looking at these socially engineered positions, well, it beggars belief. Facts that in any other time that would be self-evident are not so in our current era of mental gymnastics and cognitive dissonance, and the squealing cacophony of anything that repudiates ideology over demonstrable fact has become not the exception, but the norm. Now, previously and historically, these disparate tribes could be brought together and their differences smoothed over by a so-called super tribe. Rome did it, the West did it previously with the creation of nation-states, but like Rome, the United States is tearing itself apart from within, and like Rome, as it regressed as a society and a civilization, and as it tribalized within, so too, now in the 21st century, is America. And so then we're left with the question, is America headed to a so-called second civil war or toward a second civil war? A lot of people seem to think so, and they're spurred on by algorithmically acceptable YouTube gatekeepers that say as much, of course, along with the controlled media. But what I think that most of these people misunderstand is the difference between a civil conflict and a civil war. I can't see the country being carved up into 2 or 3 or 4 opposing territories fighting it out. There will never be another army of Northern Virginia. There will never be a California-led Western Alliance with armies drawn up of volunteers and conscripts. Yes, there are groups within the United States that hate each other, but most people just want to get about their lives. So given this reality, I think it would be all but impossible to draw up maps for a second civil war based on these criteria. As much of it, and these differences that Americans hold, much of these differences are urban versus the rest. The only thing a massive percent of the...
And it would just make sense on a completely normal basis for people living in more constricted urban environments to have different policy and political preferences from those living in the country.
Country wants and demands is largesse, more bread and more circuses. They're not interested in a civil war. Now, what is absolutely much more probable is a civil conflict, and that a civil conflict could take place within states or between states, and the actions would be something similar to the troubles in Northern Ireland. For example, especially during an acute and prolonged economic crisis that does look to be on the foreseeable future. I myself see the future in much the same way as a mid-5th century Roman would, as he looked out and surveyed his crumbling empire. An empire that was busy tearing itself apart from within, rather than making arrangements for a mutually beneficial future. Does that sound at all familiar? But by no means are these black pills. In fact, I believe this video is one gigantic white pill, because the end of a thing is only the beginning of something new. And let's be honest.
Right, so that which cannot continue eventually won't continue.
Given all of the topics brought up in this video, it would be silly not to come to the conclusion that the current iteration of the United States, well, it's not working. So perhaps the country could evolve into a devolved country, less federalized, where people...
Less federalized, I think he meant less unified, right? A system of federalism, right, means a system that devolves considerable control to states and cities, right? That is federalism, more state and local control.
People can live where they feel most agreeable.
Okay, let's get back to more highbrow discussion here between Bo Weingard and Noah Carl.
It has some consequence, of course, like, a scintilla, but almost nothing.
Yeah. But of course, the classical liberal will come back and say, okay, well, just because there are all these externalities, all these interactions and interdependencies in human society, that doesn't mean that a post-liberal state is going to improve matters by intervening everywhere.
Right.
Maybe the medicine is worse than the disease.
Yes, I think that's the important. That's one thing that I keep coming back to, which is perhaps.
Right. So in some circumstances, a liberal democracy is, the most effective form of government. Usually, though, liberalism needs some plus, right? Liberalism and nationalism, for example, seem to go pretty well together. But in certain circumstances, like liberalism combined with nationalism will also require a severe authoritarian turn if one is facing, a dire challenge to one's survival.
The myth of liberalism is the best myth to run a society, because you're right. Like, what we have to do is we have to weigh costs and benefits.
Yeah, some societies are better off with a myth of liberalism or a myth of nationalism or myth of religious nationalism. Depends upon the circumstances.
So suppose that we accept this reality that everything's interdependent. Is it better still generally to allow people to make decisions, which of course have external consequences, or is it better to have a government or some higher entity forcing decisions upon people?
Yeah, so when I was preparing for this discussion, reading around a bit about post-liberalism as it's known, it was hard for me to identify specific policies that post-liberals wanted to implement, except immigration restrictions, which I generally support.
Right.
But in other areas, it was harder to delineate the exact policy prescriptions they were making. So do you know of any?
I think they tend to be coy about asserting specific positive policies precisely because they know they might be unpopular or difficult to defend. But I will give an example of one that I think one could defend and that a post-liberal might promote: making marriage more difficult to end. So this would be a policy, like, I think post-liberals generally view the sexual revolution with some skepticism, and they view no-fault divorce with a lot of skepticism. So they might argue that, look, marriage is a public good. It's a commitment device that, and when you allow people, haphazardly or whimsically to dissolve it, you're vitiating that commitment device for other people who
Okay, I'm not at all certain that we should make divorce more difficult.
Insofar as he's cheated on his spouse.
Yeah, and I should say, I'm actually a fan of hypocrisy, and let me explain what I mean by that. I think it's a good idea often that look, some people are going to live depraved, wanton, sexually deviant lives. I understand that. I think it would actually be better for society if those people did that privately and were hypocrites about it. I don't think there's...
I mean, you think it would be better if they claimed publicly that they...
Yes.
Well, that's a kind of white lie.
Yeah, it's a kind of hypocrisy, I suppose. But yeah, okay. I mean, you could call it whatever one wants to call it. I'm a big fan of a kind of like privacy here. Like, I don't understand. And in fact, this is one of the complaints that Philo makes against liberalism, is that it often moves from a reluctant tolerance to a kind of celebration of the depraved. Like, okay.
So Alex Jones is complaining the feds are after him. They're trying to shut him down. This is what I said 5 years ago when big tech on basically one day got together to ban Alex Jones. I was quite ambivalent. It certainly didn't bother me that Alex Jones got... So regarding big tech banning Alex Jones, I think I have no opinion. I just see a lot of different arguments. So why did all these big tech companies ban him today? So if you're a right-wing activist, you say this is collusion by big tech trying to shut down an important right-wing voice to smooth the way for the Democratic Party in the 2018 elections. And if I were a right-wing activist, I mean, that would be the approach I'd be taking. So I got into a debate with Mike Benz, who was then Frame Game Radio. So Alex Jones has said so many heinous, ridiculous things, such as that a particular mass shooting was, a staged actor event, that it doesn't bother me when big tech chooses to ban him. Because as an activist, your goal is to rile people up, get them angry. It's like, oh, we gotta take action here, right? We just can't sit back and take this anymore. We've got to do something. We've got to protest. We've got to boycott. We've got to yell and scream, and we got to make our voices heard, and we've got to take back this country. Let's welcome Elliott Blatt back onto the show. Elliott, how are you, mate?
I wish I could say I was good, Luke, but this cold that I had, probably the one that you had, it just seems to drag on.
Yeah.
And it's been miserable. And I keep thinking today's the last day. And it's not. And it's like this tunnel, and the light is at the end of the tunnel, and I never seem to get there. So I wish I had better news, but I do have some good news.
Okay.
Yesterday I spent the best $35 of my life. Like,
wow.
I bought a beach umbrella, a modern beach umbrella, and it's hard to describe like what a revolution this has cost. Like, I can go anywhere, establish this beach umbrella, not get sunburned, be outside, enjoy a nice fresh sea breeze, and not be covered in gross suntan lotion. And I can't believe I didn't do this like 10 years ago.
Wait, you believe the anti-suntan lotion conspiracy theories, bro?
I just don't like the feeling and the smell of it. I don't. That's the extent that I've thought about suntan lotion. There's that weird smell that it has. I don't like.
You think suntan lotion is turning us gay?
You can't rule it out, Luke. You can't rule anything out. You don't want to take any risks. Poor Alex. I'm just so not interested in Alex Jones. I couldn't care less. But I understand there was a big Alex Jones event yesterday of some kind.
Yeah, he had some kind of meltdown saying the feds were trying to take him down.
But I didn't pay attention, but is he now like completely off the air on all regards?
I don't know. I'm like you. I find it really hard to pay him much mind.
Yeah. Well,
what about getting exercise? Are you capable of exercise? Because I find often when I've got a chronic cold, right? So the first week when you've got the flu, I think you should definitely not exercise. But after about a week or so, then I think it's important to start breathing and getting some more exercise?
I agree, but I've been just my energy level has been just so low now, and you're right. I mean, I would love to, but I have not done so.
What's your level of human connection these days?
Low, but not zero. In fact, I got spotted. I was spotted in public by a friend, and it was like sort of a similar, Larry David stop and chat situation. And so now I got hooked into a bunch of socializing that that I'm, expected to do. And I'm not exactly thrilled about it.
So socializing usually leaves you more depleted of energy than invigorated, correct?
Yes. Yes, it does. So
are there exceptions to that? I mean, are there people that you get together with in person where you feel more invigorated, such as at a schwitz, a spa, where you get together in a steam room with other men and get naked?
I don't have that pleasure. I've been denying myself this. It's my Spartan New England upbringing. It doesn't allow for such things.
I think a good, what's it called, a bathhouse? But an elevated bathhouse.
Yeah, I think it's called bathhouse. Sort of like an Apollonian bathhouse.
Yeah, an elevated one that has all the good parts of traditional gay house culture, but without any of the icky elements.
Yeah. Good question. Haven't found one yet, bro. But I'm looking. There are. I don't want to confess. I mean, I've been. Can I say this? I went to a spa. Right.
Right, for a facial.
I went to a spa, and then I later learned that theoretically this could have been construed as a bathhouse, but it wasn't that gay. But okay. I could I can't believe I just said that. So there was this thing going around where you'd go to, what is it called? Kabuki. It was a Japanese bathhouse.
Okay, right? Well, those aren't gay.
You sure?
Definitely not gay.
Yeah, but there were poofters there for sure, bro.
Right, but the whole thing as a gestalt was, you did not have a gestalt gay experience.
No. So now, Luke, when do you know that one needs to go to a doctor? Like, is it, I've been sick. I haven't gone to a doctor in years. It eventually, there needs to be a signal that says, well, perhaps you should go to a doctor. What does that feel like,
Yeah, there have been a handful of times when I've gone to, maybe one time, when I went to a doctor after I had, a flu cold that went on, and they hooked me up to some machine that, sent stuff, up my nostrils. There may have been some mild benefit. But do you have an oxygenator that measures the level of oxygen in your blood?
No.
Probably should get one. And if the level of oxygen in your blood drops below 92, then you should definitely go to the ER.
Okay. Is this something I can get on Amazon?
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon, and you can have it delivered same day or the next day. Do a little bit of research on it, but it's a very simple device that measures the level of oxygen in your body. But usually a doctor can't do much for a cold or a flu. Now, do you have a high fever? Because I don't recall having a fever.
No, I don't have a fever, and I can work.
Yeah.
And my mind is clear, and the only thing that's back is just like there's this consistent congestion that feels like it's really deep in my lungs, and it just won't heal.
Yeah, I find exercise is the best for that. So, don't exercise to the point of exhaustion, but definitely get some exercise, get outside, and I think that helps, because otherwise this can just stick around in your lungs for weeks and weeks and weeks. But with exercise, right, you get that air moving out of your lungs.
Yeah. So I took I got the umbrella and I just set it up, and I sat outside under the umbrella, breathing fresh air, but I wasn't doing any exercise because I didn't have any energy.
Now, did you buy some cheap Chinese umbrella?
I got it at Costco, Luke. And I think it was made in Mexico. It was Hecho in Mexico,
yeah, walking pneumonia. That's probably what you got, right?
Yeah. Now, is that,
So a friend of mine lied to get the pneumonia vaccine. So a friend of mine was going to get vaccinated. He was getting like his 7th COVID shot. He was getting the flu shot last fall. And then he told an untruth because he wanted the pneumonia vaccine. So he said that he had diabetes because they wouldn't give it to him unless he said he had some, comorbidity. And he lied to get a pneumonia vaccine. Sad.
Oh, hard to hear, bro.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking. What about the prospects of a civil war? Does that provide you with energy?
No, it does not. It does not, I'm afraid.
Have you seen the new Civil War movie? I mean, God forbid, don't download it from any of the sharing sites.
No, I have 2 modes. I'm working, I'm doing minor chores, or I'm sleeping. I'm not doing anything in between.
Wow, you're not even watching Netflix? Do you subscribe to Netflix?
No, I gave it up years ago. I have no desire. What was the last thing I saw on Netflix? Orange is the New Black.
The New Black.
I saw 1 episode of that, and I canceled my Netflix, and I've never entertained the notion of getting it back. Netflix just died to me that day.
Do you believe in Oriental medicine?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Have you ever done acupuncture?
Oh yeah. It was good when I had an elbow problem that went on for months and months and months. Like 4 sessions of acupuncture dealt with it. And when I went to my Kaiser doctor, right, for various problems, he said, "Oh, this is just going to be congenital. You'll probably need to have a hip replacement one day." And then I went to a good physical therapist, and with a good physical therapist, they took care of my elbow problem in 1 session. A good acupuncturist took care of my elbow problem years earlier in 4 sessions. But yeah, sometimes that good physical therapist or good acupuncturist will take care of problems that conventional Kaiser won't.
Well, I went to an acupuncturist, and this was years ago, and they set me up with these Chinese herbs. And when I'm talking about herbs here, I'm not talking about peppermint. I'm talking about this most disgusting stuff you can imagine, it was this giant shopping bag full of brush that I was supposed to boil down into this liquid. And this liquid just tasted like liquid asphalt. It was the most disgusting stuff. And I was supposed to take it 2 or 3 times a day. And I would just be dreading this. I would be shivering with fear, knowing that I would have to deal with, just take this stuff eventually. And I couldn't finish the course because it was the acrid taste was so bad and so nauseating that I couldn't finish the program.
But did it help?
Possibly.
How much of it did you take? Did you get through half of it?
Yeah, I probably got through half of it. It got to the point where I was having nightmares about it. like my neck, it just, this nightmare advised it was about me having to drink this crap.
I'm sorry that you had to go through that, Elliott.
Yeah. But, there was this trend going around San Francisco where you would have like cheap acupuncture. So it was sort of community acupuncture.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd sit
where you reused needles.
No, it wasn't that bad. Excuse me. And so for like $15, you get like an hour of sitting in a nice reclining chair with a bunch of needles in you, and in this sort of group setting. So you'd be sitting around and everyone else is in a recliner, but nobody would talk. There was this unspoken rule. You didn't talk to each other when you had a needle in you. So I was doing that for a while, but those things kind of closed up. I don't think the business model worked.
I want to confide something in you. I have like a needy component that really resonates with the personalized nature of this alternative medicine, where they treat you as something special rather than just going through conventional medicine. And it just really feels good to me emotionally. How about you? Do you enjoy like the personalized component of alternative medicine, and does it like feel good to you emotionally that you're being taken care of in a personalized manner? Like even if it were like aromatherapy or something silly.
No, not at all.
You don't like being taken care of by attractive young Asian women?
I don't dislike it, but I don't go through out of an emotional need. In fact, usually, well, I get the authentic stuff,
Oh yeah.
Real Chinese.
Real stuff, yeah.
Doing the Chinese medicine. I don't do this
not
knockoff,
Facades,
hipster, like 6-week course, I don't do any of that. But if you go to the authentic stuff, then you get the big pile of disgusting brush that you're supposed to drink. So it's a fine line that you need to walk. But some of these guys are pretty interesting. Some of the acupuncturists, some of the American acupuncturists, they have these really interesting stories. Like they got this infection surfing, and they went to conventional doctors, and the conventional doctor could do nothing. And then they went to an acupuncturist, and the acupuncturist fixed them up. And then they became acupuncturists because they were so enamored with the art and craft.
Now, I find that these stories are interesting to the degree that the person with the story is hot. But are you assessing the interestingness of these stories on objective bases or on the basis of how hot the person is?
No, I'm able to detach. The female acupuncturists I've had invariably just tell me that I need to drink more water. They don't have an interesting story beyond that. Like, it's the male ones that have the surfing stories, the motorcycle accidents, the compelling dramas. So, no.
So you don't get any charge about being taken care of by some attractive young woman. It doesn't fill you up. You can see through the BS.
I see through the BS, bro. You know me. You know me. I'm all business. I'm all business. Sorry, look, I didn't expect to be coughing so much when I called in.
No, don't worry about it, bro. We feel your pain.
So this is a marathon stream, bro. It's going on 2:00 now. What happened?
Well, I'm so frustrated with it because of the two breakdowns, and then the extra body tension that came from it, and then the more constricted, throat. And I had 2 cups of coffee. I haven't had 2 cups of coffee in months, so I don't want to waste those 2 cups of coffee. I keep expecting that at any time that caffeine is going to power me to unexpected and shattering insights that will leave me emotionally and intellectually convulsed, but still strangely relieved and released.
So you, on top of the Adderall, you have 2 cups of coffee running through your body.
Right. And so I thought this is going to be an amazing stream. Like I was intimidated by what Destiny produced. And I thought, for me to get to a Destiny level of live streaming excellence, I'm going to need massive caffeine, Adderall. I said no to modafinil on top of all that. but it was powered by my jealousy of Destiny's live streaming capabilities.
Now, Destiny has he has a history of polyamory. That doesn't bother you?
Well, I'm just looking at him objectively as a live streamer. I'm not looking to have sex with him.
Good point. Yeah, it's a key distinction.
Have you consumed much of his material? I mean, he's center left, but he also has a lot of common sense. He's pro-capitalism. He's pro-gun. He doesn't, believe that the N-word is, inappropriate in all circumstances for white people. He's willing to debate people all over the political spectrum. So even though he's center left, I respect him for a lot of things.
Yeah, I used to listen to him, and yes, I used to. When I say I used to, a little bit. There was this period for like a month where I could tolerate him, but then I found what he would debate tended to be just sort of like high school girl type of sociology crap, which is not interested to me. And but yes, he's a skilled debater. Yes, he's intelligent. But then he has this sort of egalitarian assumptions of our age. He's not into the different people have different gifts analysis. Yeah. And I don't know. I just think you can only go so far if that's not part of your worldview, because otherwise certain things just don't make sense. So
and he also debates to score points with the most ridiculous, unintellectual arguments that superficially sound impressive, but they're such low quality that they disgust me.
Right. So when he has the facts, he wields the facts effectively. Yeah. When he doesn't have the facts, he can sort of slip into sort of sophistry mode, and he's very good at that as well. And so sometimes you can be beguiled by that. So, I lost interest in him, I've lost interest in a lot of stuff, which I find a bit concerning.
Well, you're going through nihilism. I find whenever I'm sick, I enter into a nihilistic attitude.
Yeah, that's for sure. But this is even before I got sick. I was, just this idea of like always having to have the right opinion and always discovering new opinions and, just living in this world of opinions there seemed to be no point to it in the end, because having the correct opinion really didn't matter. There was no like real world consequence. Like you could believe that the world is flat, right? Yeah. You could be totally convinced of it, which is a stupid opinion, but you could nevertheless live a very successful, fulfilling life. The two are non-overlapping magisteria. So,
yes. That's profound. And discourse surfing just gets tiring when people are just making like instantaneous opinions for clicks, which is sort of Destiny's modus vivendi, as opposed to something that's more considered, and even though it's less dramatic, it's more possibly valuable. Yeah. Such as this show.
Well, I think, good debate should be about, here's the thing. It's only worth thinking about things that have a practical application. If there's no practical application to what you're thinking about, you're wasting your time. It's not a good use of time. You need to enhance your health. You need to enhance your emotional well-being or your financial well-being. These are things worth thinking about. Thinking about, is John Mearsheimer right about this and wrong about that, doesn't have any consequence,
Yeah.
Like, is Russia and Ukraine, is Russia right, is Ukraine right? There's no practical expression of that, of having that right opinion.
Yeah. What do you think about the idea that we tend to see the world as we are rather than as it is? So I remember, for example, with Dennis Dale, like any news story, it would just be a reason for him to become even more depressed about the trajectory of the United States.
Yes. No, he started black-pilled and he ended black-pilled.
And every major news story was just a further reason for him to get black-pilled. And I noticed this with a lot of friends, like particularly dissident friends. every major news development is just an excuse to become more black-pilled.
Yes.
And that's tiring, and it's depressing, and it's not intellectually impressive.
Yeah, and like, we have a mutual acquaintance, and, I still run into him once in a while. And he's still, he's really into this sort of dissident ideology. And all of his talking points sort of revolve around it. And it's just so tiring and exhausting to be around that I can't wait to sort of separate myself from the conversation. And then I feel like, I feel relieved when I'm just not having to participate in it. And, and it's sort of like, it's a mask. I've come to see it as sort of this obsession is just a mask for some shortcomings in his own life, Yeah. And,
it wears on one. I mean, I've got, like in Orthodox Judaism, almost all my friends are right wing, but I've got one thoughtful right wing friend who's just tired of going to Shabbat meals to hear these low IQ critiques of the Biden administration. Like when you hear these tropes over and over again, it's just wearing.
Yeah. Like Styx Hexenhammer, like I'm not subscribed to him, but he still appears on my feed. And it just seems like he's, he rose to fame with his sort of
alt-right adjacent.
Yeah, well, his big, I think he rose to fame because he made this prescient prediction that Trump would win the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. And this bought him a tremendous amount of credibility and audience. And that's all he ever talks about is Trump this, Trump that, Trump this, Trump that. Here's my analysis of Trump, and it's always, his conclusions are always pro-Trump, and it's just a fait accompli. And this type of discussion is just tedious.
What about Civil War videos? Why the United States is heading for a civil war? Do you find that tedious?
I don't believe it's true. Yes, I find it tedious. I think, I don't really have any predictions about what's going to happen, but things are just kind of going to grind along, and sometimes they're going to get messy and weird, and then something new happens, and then you just don't know.
I mean, I remember so many examples from my own life when I was absolutely convinced that these cataclysmic developments were heading our way, or I just had some hyperbolic reaction to life that upon reflection just seems so silly.
Yes. And I think back when I was really young and all the strange political crap I believed in then, it's like, it's so embarrassing. I'm so glad the internet wasn't around when I was young, because I would have probably, I would have consigned myself to irrelevance.
So
I would have been unemployable.
Bell saying, Luke used to monitor people like, Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes. And my reaction is these guys are meretricious, right? They say things that are exciting often, but it's such a transparent ploy for attention. The shifting, particularly of Richard Spencer, the constant dramatic shifts. It's such a meretricious appeal. Meretricious means showy, but lacking in substance. It's such a showy appeal for our attention that I just got tired of it.
Yeah, I've come to my conclusion on Richard Spencer. The problem with Richard Spencer is he's not a completer. He's capable of starting things, but he can't see things to the end. And I think this is true of a lot of people with trust funds or with, wealth, independent wealth that's not from work. They can't buckle down and get through the difficult parts. They'd rather sort of get something started, get the exciting part out of the way. And then, there's always something more tantalizing that you could jump to and just go to the next dopamine hit rather than sort of grind through the nasty bits to get something in. So, and so he has this sort of he just has this disparaging attitude towards sort of basic block and tackling of politics, right? He does, things like crime and gas prices and, these sort of bread and butter, boring issues. He has no stomach for it because he wants to talk about these big, mythological themes and literary motifs that go on between this community and that community, on and on and on. But just he's just afraid of grit. Some people, he has no grit. And
I remember about 3 years ago, someone associated with the Southern Poverty Law Center, someone like Jared Hort, who's like an anti-right-wing researcher with, basic Marxist view of the world. He condemned people who attacked Richard Spencer, and essentially he said, Richard Spencer is on our side now. People should stop giving him a hard time. And so that made me think, because Colin Liddell just posted, Richard Spencer didn't change his views, the feds just got to him, and maybe there's something to that.
I don't know. I don't know who's a Fed and who's not a Fed. I don't know how to process those types of assertions. Yeah. You hear them so often.
Yeah.
And how would you know? And, everyone's either a Fed or a pedophile, on the dissident right.
Right.
And it's like, just throw up your hands. So, I think a real, the things that kids need to learn today aren't sexy. They're not, and they're boring, and they're practical. And there needs to be a voice for sort of the joys of getting things done and being practical and developing skills. And just turn off the internet, and especially in your 20s, and just, you gotta pay your dues in your 20s. And there needs to be that voice.
So what have you been listening to? Surely you need some entertainment. You're not subscribing to Netflix. So have you been getting your entertainment from YouTube?
I'm pure YouTube. I'm pure YouTube all the way. And I just use it as a radio. I don't really watch it because, I have things to do, man. I got a business to run. I got shit going on, bro.
And how is that working out?
Not well. It's been one headache after another. I'm slowly drowning, but you committed to, you start something, you think it's going to go one way, you think it's going to be easy, and you think it's not going to consume you. And the fact is, you don't know what's going to happen, and things do tend up not going the way you expect them to do, and they do end up consuming you. And so I'm learning that painful lesson. But I'm in too deep now. I can't back out. Or if I were to, I'd have to, take a big loss, which I'm not willing to do.
So the chat says, instead of wondering if dissidents are pedophiles or feds, we can just call them pedophiles.
Why not? I tuned into Ethan Ralph the other day. He came up on Twitter, and I'd only listened to other people critiquing him. And so I tried to listen to him firsthand. And the whole show just seemed to be about him, his problems, and his enemies, and how his enemies are conspiring against him, and how they're pieces of shit, and how, he's so put upon, and he didn't do nothing, just boring stuff. And it just goes on for hours and hours and hours. And these people have committed to this streaming lifestyle, and because they saw this dopamine, right? It was like, here's a great way to make a living that's pure dopamine and really involves no hard work. And now they've paradoxically turned into workaholics because they have to stream. They have to stream just to make their bacon. And it's life has a way of doing this. It backfires in ways. You see a shortcut, you think it's a shortcut, but rarely it turns out to be a long cut because you just didn't want to start at the beginning and do it.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, similar thing with Destiny. Like most of his streams are about, fighting with his enemies. That I'm forgetting the left-wing streamers who, to the left of Destiny. Like much of his streams taken up with, fighting these various lefties and how reprehensible they are.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, sure.
So what have you been listening to? Anything good? Have you
I'm
been
running
listening
out. I need some ear candy. I started listening to music again, which is odd. There's some good music out there on YouTube, so you kind of have to look for it. As in contrast to the absolute crap that's on the radio. So I've been trying to listen to the radio in the car, and I don't know why. It's this masochistic urge I have. But I used to remember being able to turn on the radio and like what I listened to. And now it is so idiotic. And there's like 3 channels that are potentially have some interesting things to listen to. But they're all punctuated by this crap. And it's just amazing that there's like 30 stations on the dial and there's still nothing to listen to. I don't know. It's a pet peeve of mine. Because I do love the radio. I've always liked the radio. And so by the way, yes. So anyway, what am I listening? I'm listening to a lot of music, listening to lectures here and there, but not about politics. And like I said, mostly sleeping in the interim. I listen to something and I look for boring stuff, so it will put me to sleep.
Yeah.
It's not because I want to listen to it.
Yeah, I'm currently listening to this Richard Ben Kramer book, What It Takes. It's about the 1988 election. I've already read it about 10, 15 years ago, but I just let it play all night as I move in and out of sleep and as I struggle with my CPAP. Like I try to leave my CPAP on, but sometimes I just give up. It's driving me crazy, which activates me, which makes it more difficult for me to sleep. So I just take it off. Have lower quality sleep without it. But instead of letting my mind wander into dangerous neighborhoods, I just leave Richard Ben Kramer playing all night. Is that Morse code? Are you tapping for
I was trying to mute my coughing. So this CPAP machine, are you ever going to outgrow this? That seems like really a cumbersome thing.
Well, first of all, it's often got some benefits in that sending air up my nostrils, which will often open up my nasal passages. So I don't know about you, but sometimes my nasal passages, get clogged up way too easily. And so just having a device that will open up my nasal passages is fantastic. And sometimes I find it a comfort. And so having an additional source of comfort that also gives me higher quality rest and sleep. So it has some benefits. Apparently, sleep apnea does not get worse after about age 60 or 65. So according to my test about 15 years ago, I've got mild sleep apnea when I sleep on my side and moderate sleep apnea when I sleep on my back. But when I had the test done, I weighed 180 pounds. So now I weigh 170 pounds. And even like that 10-pound difference can make a significant decrease in sleep apnea. So it's a little help.
But it just seems so cumbersome to have this device strapped to you when you're trying to sleep, no?
Yeah, so it certainly can get on my nerves. The important thing is that I use it to serve me rather than me being a servant of the CPAP. If I can keep the CPAP a servant to my best interests and not allow myself to get too agitated about it and not condemn myself for not using it as much as I should, then it serves me. It's like the phone, right? If you're constantly jumping for notifications on your phone, then your phone has become maladaptive. So any new channels that you've been checking out on YouTube?
Oh, not really. I listened to Ken Brown. He popped up on my feed. I listened to him the other day, and I was so disappointed. He sort of weighed in on this Steve Saylor thing, and it was very clear that he'd never read.
Oh, yeah. I was very disappointed in that too. Yeah, it was crap.
It was so bad.
So bad.
And yet he fancies himself this sort of guru figure,
Yeah.
with this knowledge. And he's managed to convince a certain amount of people that he has this knowledge. And all he does is just ad lib, ad infinitum, with no basis whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I found it really unimpressive. And I think he's just another Richard Spencer type that has never really done anything. He's never saw anything on to completion. He's just kind of skidded along the surface and is paid no consequence,
And just trying to create a cult.
Yeah. And I thought people that said that they were doing that were just joking, but it's literally true. That's what he's trying to do. And he thinks he has access to some sort of special knowledge. And I can't believe I drove that guy around in my car. Like, I was embarrassed, it was really disappointing. And so I wrote a comment in his chat, like, have you ever read a single Steve Saylor column? Which went unreplied to.
Yeah, I was disappointed in it too, because Ken Brown is very intelligent, right? He has a huge upside, right? This guy, properly directed, could be a tremendous force for good, but he's wasting his skills because he seems like he's disconnected from ordinary forms of human connection. So it doesn't feel like he belongs to a church. It doesn't feel like he has mentors. Doesn't feel like he's part of a strongly connected family, extended family, or community. And so he's relying on signals from his audience about how to direct his efforts. And it just seems a vast waste of his considerable talent.
Yeah. The Chinese have an expression, or like the Kung Fu community. I think it was on either like Kung Fu, the TV series, or Kung Fu, like a Kung Fu movie. And I don't know how it goes in Chinese, but they say that you cannot taste bitter, right? Which goes to the lack of grit.
Mm-hmm.
If you're really going to sort of be a leader, you have to break new ground, and you have to see things out. You have to go, you have to push through, and you can't just fake it, because it becomes apparent to everybody.
Now,
even without knowing the subject, you can know that
it's
just not coming from an authentic place. You can just tell that this guy isn't deeply rooted.
So I often find tremendous benefit along with the pain of illness in that it forces me to stop doing things that I habitually do. It usually acts like pressing reset on my computer. Like I basically shut down and then slowly restart my life when I get sick like this. I stop doing things and thinking things that are habitual to me. I tend to kind of rethink everything that I'm committed and dedicated to. And I start playing out in my mind, if I go in a different direction, how might this work out? So it's like an adaptive use of depression. Like when you're depressed and when you're sick, you stop doing habitual things and you stop thinking along traditional lines, and you start questioning everything that you're committed to. And then out of that often emerges a clarity and a redirecting for one's life. I don't know if you've experienced this.
I feel like it's sort of like everything's been sort of stripped back to bare wood, and you have to build things up a little bit more carefully. So I've been really reflecting. I eat well and I exercise, and I generally lead a healthy lifestyle. But I've been really reflecting on, like, what more can I do? Like, I shouldn't be punished like this. I don't deserve this. They don't do this to fucking me, bro. So yeah, I've been looking at, I've been thinking about the words I say, like, and like not remaining silent when I could remain silent. Like there's a lot of opportunities to just not say anything, which are probably better. There's opportunities to just be a bit more tactical, a bit more strategic, and not fritter away time or resources, or just make better choices. So yeah, that's what illness does for me. And I just feel like I do that anyway, and I don't need to be punished like this. That's the point I don't get.
But it's so profound. Like it reduces you to your knees, and it forces you to rethink things that are painful, and you wouldn't naturally predispose to rethink them if your life was going along fine.
Absolutely. Yes. You don't learn from the good times, pain makes you reflect. It makes you introspective.
And I become much more willing to consider that I was wrong in this or that when I'm sick.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that.
Because the self-righteousness and the self-assuredness and the exaggerated sense of one's own importance, I find gets ripped away when I'm sick.
Yes, it's humbling for sure.
Yeah.
Like, and you're like when you get up and you're like coughing and you don't know if your coughs are going to be successful or not. And if they're not successful, you're just going to suffocate to death. It's scary. And so there's a certain mortality reckoning.
Yeah. It makes you realize how vulnerable we are, how easily we can, shuffle off this mortal coil, and sometimes how much we need other people. But has that realization also hit you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. As I'm getting older now. And that's just the thing. It's like, is this just a bad flu, or am I getting older? You have this calculus you have to do now. Well, maybe you just don't have the immune system you used to, Colin says I should wear a mask when I'm out in public. I thought about that, and I just don't know. I just, it pains me. It just pains me to like look into the window and see a masked retard looking back at you, and then realizing that masked retard is you. I just don't know I could do that.
So you still believe in something. You believe that masks are stupid. So you haven't reached 100% nihilism.
Yeah, holding on by a thread. And then I'm like, how did I get this? Like, can I trace this to a particular person? And am I entitled to something? Can I sue them? You go through all kinds of thoughts like this. Like, how can they do this to fucking me? Types of thoughts. So anyway, I'm going to try and spend a month on figuring out lung health and immunity boosting. I don't want to ever go through this again. I just done with it. I've learned what I needed to learn. And is this possible? Am I just barking up the wrong tree? Like, are there people that go through life that just don't get waylaid by these disgusting flus every 18 months?
Yeah. I was talking to a woman who hasn't been sick, with the flu since before COVID.
You're quite a bit.
Yeah, I get. Well, this is the first time.
I lost you.
Yeah, this is the first time that I was this sick in a year. To the best of my knowledge, I might be blanking out on something. But yeah, I typically get the flu probably 3 times a year. I'm typically down like 2 weeks a year.
Oh, that's even more than me, man. It's probably related to the CPAP issue. Whatever's driving the CPAP problem is probably driving your flu. That's a long time. 2 weeks a year is a lot of time.
Stephen James says Elliott needs some antibiotics and a short course of steroids like prednisone, and he'll be fixed in a couple of weeks. Go to the doctors, for God's sake. Do you have health insurance?
No, I don't.
Oh, my God.
I don't. You know why?
Wow. Why?
Well, because every time I've used it, it doesn't cover the things that I want, which are dental. When I've had it, I want dental insurance, right? I want to go in and get my teeth dealt with. None of these health insurances cover a significant amount of, it doesn't cover the stuff you need, right? It covers all of this other stuff that I don't need. And I just can't get anything approximating value for money. So, and the other thing is, if anything ever serious happens to you, you just bargain them down, and you can bargain them down. You say, listen, I don't have insurance. I'll give you X, and they'll accept X, because the whole pricing of medicine in the United States is predicated on the fact that they know how to extract as much as possible from insurance companies. We have a terrible, terrible health insurance system.
Life is incredibly precarious in the United States. Like, we're the only first world country without socialized medicine. I'm not saying we should have it, but the fact is there's so much more fear in America for the average person.
Yeah, but that's sort of not true. If you can't pay for anything, you just get it for free, and they bill you until you're dead, but you still get medical care, right?
Yeah, you still get medical care, but you can go bankrupt. A lot of Americans go bankrupt because they have so many medical expenses.
That's probably true too. But you look at the way most people eat in America, they act as though healthcare is free, right? You look at the disgusting food that's available at supermarkets. They eat stupid food, they get preventable diseases, and all the insurance money, all of the healthcare dollars get applied towards people who are too stupid to take care of themselves. And the rest of us who do eat properly, who may occasionally break their arm skiing like myself, and maybe, need a healthcare for some sort of outlier event, I have to pay top dollar because the health insurance system is designed to subsidize retards. It's the retard tax all over again. And go ahead.
You seem to think that being healthy is a result of moral choice, when here I'll give you a rejoinder to that, is that the people who are leading the most social lives, right? People who have children who are in school, right? They're going to get sick much more than people who don't, because their kids go to school, pick up things, and then transmit it to their parents. And people who have active social lives are going to get sick much more than those who don't have active social lives. So am I correct that you believe largely that staying healthy is the result of an individual's moral choices?
I wouldn't say necessarily moral. I would just say practical and sensible. Like, the last 100 years, 100 years ago, all food was organic food, right? There was not this distinction because people just ate organic food. They ate home-cooked meals. They did a moderate amount of exercise as part of living their lives, and they maintained their health. People were healthier back then. You look at all the advancements in medicine, you would think there'd be some sort of decline in the amount of illness, right? But no, everything has gotten worse. And things have gotten worse is because we eat like retards. The food system is for retards. The advertising of food is directed at retards, and retards listen to this advertising and they act on it, and then they become, disgustingly unhealthy. So it's not moral, it's practical. It's simply a matter of cause and effect. And, we all pay the price.
Yeah, this is part of your hero system, but is there any peer-reviewed academic research that supports your point of view, Elliott? I think you've got bad epistemics, bro.
My epistemics are fine, bro. It's practical, right? you don't go to supermarkets to get all your stuff sent to you by Amazon. But if you go to like a Costco, you literally cannot look at anybody else. You have to look at the floor because you'll see one disgusting spectacle after another. You know, some retard in a mobility scooter with like, you know, giant, you know, boxes of cake stacked on top of one another. It's just one disgusting scene after another. Food needs to be hard to come by. It needs to be more expensive, and it needs to be rationed.
I mean, we've all got to have an ethos. I mean, so this is your ethos. I mean, it's better than National Socialism.
Well, listen. The last time I went to a doctor, and it was for this it was sort of for the asthma thing. They gave me this stuff, and I took it, and my arms just broke out in hives, and it didn't address my breathing issue, right? So not only could I not breathe, my entire arms were just festooned with these itchy hives. I just don't get value from the medical system. Anyway.
Okay, so I thought that cold and flu is basically the same. So Glib Medley was saying in the chat, I haven't had the flu in 30 years, but I get colds. And so it depends on your perspective. So influenza and the common cold, they're both contagious respiratory illnesses, but they are caused by different viruses. That's according to the CDC. So I guess there is a significance. Flu is caused by influenza viruses only. The common cold can be caused by a number of different viruses, such as rhinoviruses, para-influenza, and seasonal coronaviruses.
All right. There's 3 candidates now. There's RSV, which is some sort of respiratory virus. There's our good friend COVID. Don't mention it. I don't want to protect your stream. But now there's talk of bird flu going around. I don't know. You know, I don't know what I had, but enough's enough. I mean,
but you feel that this is a reflection on you as a man.
Well, no.
Yeah, because you're saying that. Go ahead.
Well, I just feel unlucky. That's all. I don't know. Like, shouldn't it be enough to eat properly and get moderate exercise? And if you get a cold, maybe it's a 1 or 2 day thing, and not this 2 week, bout with death.
But it's clearly not true, because people who eat exceptionally well but have young children, in my empirical experience, they get sick more often than people who don't eat as well but simply don't have young children.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's why I should never leave the house. Not have to interact with these people.
How would you compare this current flu with your episode of throat gonorrhea?
Good question. You know, I made a little spreadsheet to compare the two, and I was, tabulating. I had a little scoring system, and it was very difficult. It's sort of in progress right now.
Yeah. Have you ever had a sexually transmitted disease?
No, I haven't had the pleasure.
Really? You don't have like genital warts or anal warts or syphilis or?
Oh, yeah, I had a touch of the monkeypox. I did have a touch of monkeypox. Yeah, I forgot about that. I blocked it out. How about you, Luke?
No, I never have. And I've been, I'm not boasting. I'm saying this with shame. I've been quite the player.
Yeah, you're the most likely to, right? You
right.
Really,
I mean, I've been around. I mean, I did some intrepid undercover investigative reporting in certain industries that you would think they have predisposed me to.
Yeah, you had some industrial occupational hazards that you had to navigate.
And I was willing to do that for you, for the public to, dig down deep to get to the bottom, to stay on top.
Yeah, we know that and we appreciate it. Look, that's why all 10 of us tune in week after week. So anyway, all right. Look, listen, that's about it.
Okay, blessings, bro.
All right, blessings. All right, bye.
That's the activist approach. it's like a close-up in a movie, okay, or a TV show. Like a close-up is more emotionally intense, generally speaking, than a long shot, okay? And so the activist point of view is close-up, it's emotionally intense, it's, you know, we got to get angry, we got to take action, we got to get back at these guys, we got to, you know, go into combat, we got to fight back, okay? So my personality, generally speaking, is to look at things from the 10,000 foot level. Okay, that's my tendency. It's not to be an activist. It's not to rile people up. I like people to get happy. Because I think 95% of people, 95% of the time, can glide through life. And 95% of the time, my opinion is if you're not gliding through life, that's because of you. Right? If you're... I'm talking about people in the first world, in normal situations, not in awful situations. Going through life, creating turbulence, getting banned, getting kicked out of places, losing friends, getting disinvited, deplatformed. My bias is that's primarily on you. So an activist bias is, look how unfair this is, we're getting screwed, big tech is out to get us. And so I don't think that's primarily what's going on with Alex Jones. I think he was operating on thin ice. And then he said something recently that was just so far over the line that not many people of goodwill are going to say, yeah, this guy needs to be on these major social media platforms. So what did he say recently? And he said essentially that he was going to intimate that he was going to shoot George Mueller, the special counsel investigator of the Russian collusion story. So I think that went down something like July 22nd. If you just Google Alex Jones and his comments, his threats against George Mueller, I think that was just the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. So there are many reasons I'm not a big fan of Alex Jones. I think his hawking of what seemed like really shoddy supplements just makes his show the equivalent of a bad neighborhood. Okay, if you're gonna, hawk what seem like ridiculous supplements, and I'm a big fan of. But that's almost all right-wing content. All right, almost all right-wing radio shows and commercially successful podcasts and live streams hawk absolutely ridiculous, brain-dead supplements. So it's not like I think, all supplements are horrible. No, big fan of supplements, but the way I just don't trust Alex Jones. Okay, I'm glad he's on our side, I guess. I'm glad he's a Trump supporter. I'm glad he energizes low IQ people who follow him. But everything pretty much about him gives me the willies. So there was a very funny on that show, that HBO show with that English comedian, just like did a 15-minute segment on Alex Jones's supplement shilling, and it's just so cringeworthy. So I'm not an Alex Jones fan. I'm not outraged by him either. But to say that Sandy Hook was a government plot, okay, I think that's ridiculous.
You're listening to Why is Charlie Kirk Selling Me Food Rations by Ali Breland, published on the 22nd of May, 2024. This audio article was produced by audio journalism app NOAA, News Over Audio, Charlie Kirk Show. But it can't and won't ruin my day, he continued. Why? 'Cause I start my day with a hot America First.
Okay, I missed the opening. All right, Charlie Kirk is worked up. The world is in flames, and Biden economics is a complete and total disaster, conservative influencer said during a recent episode of his podcast, The Charlie Kirk Show. But it can't and won't ruin my day.
Cup of blackout coffee. Liberals have brought about economic Armageddon, but first, coffee. Listening to Kirk's show, which is among the most popular podcasts on the right, can be unsettling, even if you are a conservative. In the past year, the founder of Turning Point USA has uploaded episodes with titles such as The Great Replacement Isn't Theory, It's Reality, and The Doctors Plotting to Mutilate Your Kids. He has also conducted friendly interviews with a blogger who once described slavery as a natural human relationship, and discussed crime stats with the white supremacist Steve Saylor, in a way that veered toward race science. Andrew Colvett, a spokesperson for Kirk, declined to comment for this story. But the advertisements Kirk reads are sometimes more dire and polemical than what he and his guests talk about during the show.
But this is true for virtually all right-wing radio streaming content.
Rest assured, knowing that you're ready for whatever the globalists throw at us next, Kirk said at the end of one ad for medical emergency kits. These ads espouse conservative values and talking points, mostly in service of promoting brands such as Blackout Coffee, which sells a Second Amendment medium roast blend, and Covert Op cold brew. The commercial breaks sounded like something from an alternate universe. The more I listened to them, the more I came to understand that that was the point. Some brands, of course, speak the language of Democrats, touting their climate commitments and diversity efforts. But when I listened to left-of-center podcasts, including Pod Save America, Michelle Obama, The Light Podcast, and MSNBC's Prosecuting Donald Trump, I mostly heard ads from an assortment of nonpartisan brands, such as Ford, Jefferson's Ocean-Aged at Sea Bourbon, eHarmony, and Simply Safe.
Right, so it helps if your side dominates our institutions. Right, then it's a lot easier to have respectable advertisers.
The closest equivalent I found was Cariuma, a sustainable shoe brand that sponsors Pod Save America. The right, meanwhile, has long-hawked products that you don't typically see advertised on mainstream outlets and shows. In 2007, the historian Rick Pearlstein chronicled a far-fetched investment opportunity involving stem cells and placentas advertised on the far-right website, Newsmax. Supplements and gold have become part of conservative advertising canon, as the writer Sam Criss summed up in his recent essay on the ads that appear in National Review's print magazine. The same apocalyptic note ran through all these ads. The hospitals will shut down, the planet will...
And this substantiates my point that the dominant right-wing discourse over talk radio and live streams and podcasts is moronic, along with the quality of the advertising.
Freeze over, you personally are getting old and dying, and now your money might be worthless if you haven't put it all in gold. Some of Kirk's ads hit the same beats. At times, they sound a little jarring.
And I have these right-wing friends who are just continually pushing me to invest in gold or invest in silver, to invest in this or that.
Are 9 meals away from anarchy, he said in one ad for buckets of food rations, from a website called mypatriotsupply.com.yet. As the world of...
And I advertised them for months, and I got some of their product. I keep it, in safety, but you get something like 90 meals for $150. It's a good deal.
Right-wing coded products has expanded, so has the weirdness of ads for them. For 10 years, Patriot Mobile has been America's only Christian conservative wireless provider. Started another ad. Switching to Patriot Mobile, Kirk explained, would mean that you're sending the message that you support free speech, religious liberty, the sanctity of life, the Second Amendment, our military veterans and first responder heroes, while getting the same coverage you've been accustomed to without funding the left. How? By renting access to all 3 major networks via a business deal with T-Mobile, a company that has positioned itself as at least nominally left of center on some issues. If listeners are feeling charitable, Kirk has options for them too. Hey everybody, exciting news, very, very important. We are saving babies with preborn. Kirk opened up a dollar-matching promo for a group raising money for ultrasounds, apparently having managed to quantify the precise dollar amount it would take to stop a woman from having an abortion. For a one-time $15,000 gift, you'll provide not just 1 ultrasound machine, but 2, saving thousands of babies for years to come. $280 saves 10 babies. $28 a month saves a baby a month for less than $1 a day. Conservative podcasts have become mega popular in recent years.
So when I was a teenager, I wanted to donate to these organizations where you can feed one hungry child for just $20 a month. But my parents thought that might be too much of a commitment for me.
And are some of the most trusted sources of news on the right. Kirk's show ranks as the 12th most popular news podcast on Spotify right now. The show is also syndicated on radio stations across the country and posted on YouTube, where Kirk has 1.7 million subscribers.
And Rick in the chat says we need our own parallel institutions. We do, and we've made some progress. All right, we've got Rumble. We've the right is doing better, but still we have to face it. The left and the center left dominate our institutions.
And although conservative...
So my point is, remember, there was a feeling in 2019, 2020 that almost all out live streaming options were just going to get strangled by left-wing censorship, and that hasn't turned out.
Conservative influencers, including Candace Owens, Matt Walsh, and Jack Posobiec, also promote gold or supplements, or both, on their own shows. Kirk's ads were the most varied of the conservative pod.
So most of these companies selling gold is just a complete ripoff. So it must sap your soul to be promoting things that are bad for people.
Podcast ads I listen to. Some conservatives, however, want no part of these kinds of ads. Earlier this month, the right-wing YouTuber Steven Crowder made fun of his contemporaries for hawking shitty supplements. Most of it is selling you crap you don't need from people who don't care about you. Crowder yelled at the end of a 4-minute rant on the matter. The ads reflect the new paradigm of advertising.
Well, good for Steven Crowder.
In previous decades, ads had to appeal to whole segments of the population, and products were made with that in mind. That some readers of Vanity Fair might want a Givenchy handbag, and some readers of Sports Illustrated might want Callaway golf clubs, was as targeted as ads could get. Now the country has fractured into partisan subgroups, and companies have access to reams of analytics that enable them to target ever more precise demographics. Through shows like Kirk's, brands such as Blackout Coffee and Patriot Mobile can reach their relatively niche audiences more easily than ever.
So the apocalyptic tone of the dominant right-wing discourse, matches the apocalyptic tone of these ads. And there's something about apocalyptic, which refers to the time of the end, because my father specialized in it.
Blackout Coffee and Patriot Mobile did not respond to my requests for comment. But something else is happening too. Kirk and the rest of the conservative podcast ecosystem aren't just selling wares. The ads, with some exceptions, are not like ads for beer or pickup trucks that detract from the action while one watches, say, a football game. Rather, conservative ads are constitutive. They enhance and reinforce the arguments that Kirk and others are already making on their podcasts. That black people are prone to crime, whiteness is getting excised, abortion is murder, and the United States is unstable and on the verge of collapse.
And the chat says the gold won't mean much when you need tools and food. Well, the best thing that you should invest in is your relationships with your family, your extended family, your friends, and your community.
The commercial breaks are the final screws needed to construct a self-contained conservative chamber. Kirk has ensconced himself in a world in which he'll likely never face external pressures to self-moderate in the way that, say, Rush Limbaugh occasionally did when he went too far beyond the tastes of mainstream advertisers. When you're listening to Kirk talk about Blackout Coffee, you can also look down and see the steam coming off your own cup of Blackout Coffee, and relax while its caffeine helps you be awake, not woke. You can open a new browser tab and check in on your portfolio, whose wealth managers are endorsed by Kirk, and then look at the price of gold and think about your own supply procured from a company that Kirk himself vetted from top to bottom.
Okay, that will